The wind screamed across the Dakota plains at 40 below zero, and Marin Elwood knew, with the certainty that only a mother facing death can know, that her 3 children would not survive until morning. The tent canvas snapped and tore. Her youngest had stopped shivering, which meant his body was giving up. And then, through the white wall of the blizzard, a shadow appeared. A cowboy. He looked down at them, at her frostbitten hands, at her dying children, and said 2 words that would change everything. Not tonight. What happened next? Stay with me until the end of this story, and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this journey takes us. The winter of 1887 arrived in the Dakota Territory like a thief with murder on its mind. It came without warning, without mercy, and without any intention of leaving survivors. The old-timers who had weathered decades of prairie winters would later call it the worst storm in living memory, the kind of blizzard that rewrote the landscape and erased entire homesteads from existence. But on the evening of January 12th, as the temperature plunged and the sky turned the color of bruised iron, none of that mattered to Marin Elwood. All that mattered was keeping her children alive for 1 more hour. She crouched inside the remnants of what had once been a decent canvas tent, her body curved protectively around 3 small forms. The wind had already torn away half the structure, leaving them exposed to gusts that cut through clothing like razors made of ice. Her oldest, Clara, was 11 years old and trying desperately not to cry. Her middle child, Samuel, was 8 and had stopped talking an hour ago, a silence that terrified Marin more than any sound could have. And her youngest, baby Thomas, just 4 years old, lay motionless against her chest, his breathing shallow and his skin the wrong color. "Mama," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "Mama, I can't feel my feet anymore." "I know, sweetheart." Marin pulled her daughter closer, though she had no warmth left to give. "I know, just hold on, just a little longer." But hold on to what? Hope had abandoned them 3 days ago when the last of their firewood burned to ash. Faith had fled when their mule collapsed in the snow and didn't get up again. And strength, whatever strength Marin had once possessed, had been stripped away piece by piece over the past 18 months, ever since her husband Daniel had died of fever and left her alone with 3 children, no money, and a debt she could never repay. The tent shuddered as another gust slammed into it. Canvas snapped like a whip crack, and suddenly the flap was gone entirely, ripped away into the white void of the storm. Snow poured in, covering them in seconds, and Marin felt something inside her begin to break. "This is it," she thought. "This is how we die." She had imagined death before. During the long, hungry nights when the children cried themselves to sleep, during the brutal summer when she'd worked 16-hour days in Dawes Heller's fields, only to be told her wages had been applied to her debt. She had imagined death as a release, a final escape from the grinding misery that her life had become. But she had never imagined it like this, never imagined watching her children freeze to death in her arms while she sat helpless, unable to do anything but hold them and whisper lies about how everything would be all right. "Mama." Samuel's voice was thin, distant. "There's someone outside." Marin didn't look up. The cold was making the boy hallucinate. It happened. She'd heard stories of freezing men who saw angels or demons in the snow who walked toward phantom lights until their hearts stopped beating. "There's no one outside, Samuel. It's just the storm." "No, Mama. Look." Something in his voice made her raise her head, and through the swirling white chaos of the blizzard, she saw it too. A shadow, moving toward them, getting larger. Her first thought was wolf. Wolves had been following them for days, drawn by the scent of weakness and the promise of easy prey. She'd thrown rocks at them, screamed herself hoarse, stayed awake through entire nights with a broken piece of wood clutched in her frozen hands. If they attacked now, she wouldn't be able to fight them off. She could barely move her fingers. The shadow grew closer, took shape, and Marin realized it wasn't a wolf. It was a man. He emerged from the storm like something out of a fever dream, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy coat that was caked with ice. A hat pulled low over his face, nearly buried in snow. He walked with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who had spent their entire life in this harsh country, who understood its rhythms and knew how to survive its cruelties. He stopped at the edge of their ruined tent and looked down at them. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind screamed, the snow fell, and Marin stared up at this stranger, this apparition, this man who had appeared out of nowhere in the middle of a killing blizzard. "Please," she heard herself say. Her voice cracked on the word, barely more than a whisper. "Please, my children." The man's face was hidden in shadow, impossible to read. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, snow collecting on his shoulders, ice forming in his beard. And then, slowly, he crouched down to their level. "How long have you been out here?" His voice was low and rough, weathered by years of wind and solitude. There was no warmth in it, no softness, but there was no cruelty either. Just a simple question, asked by a man who needed information. 3 days, Marin said. "Maybe 4. I can't remember anymore." The man's eyes moved over her children. Clara, shivering uncontrollably. Samuel, pale and silent. Little Thomas, barely breathing against her chest. "The little one," he said. "He's in bad shape." "I know." Tears she didn't know she still had left froze on her cheeks. "I know. I've been trying to keep him warm, but I can't. I don't have anything left. I don't—" "Stop talking." The command was sharp, but not unkind. The man reached out with gloved hands and, without asking permission, lifted Thomas from her arms. Marin's instinct was to fight, to claw and scream and protect her child from this stranger. But she was too weak. And somewhere, in some deep part of her mind that hadn't yet frozen, she understood that this man wasn't trying to hurt them. He was trying to help. "Can you walk?" he asked, cradling Thomas against his chest with surprising gentleness. I think so." "Then get up, both of you." He looked at Clara and Samuel. "We're leaving, now." Clara grabbed Marin's arm. "Mama, who is he? Where is he taking us?" "I don't know, sweetheart." Marin struggled to her feet, every muscle screaming in protest. "But we can't stay here." The man was already moving, carrying Thomas into the storm. Marin took Samuel's hand in one of hers and Clara's in the other, and together they followed the stranger into the howling white darkness. What? His name, she would learn later, was Ridge Callahan. But in that moment, stumbling through snow that came up to her thighs, fighting wind that seemed determined to knock her down, he was simply the only thing standing between her family and death. He led them maybe 200 yards from their ruined campsite, though it felt like miles, to where a horse and sled waited in the partial shelter of a rocky outcropping. The horse was a massive draft animal, built for exactly this kind of brutal weather, and it stood patiently despite the storm raging around it. "Get in the sled," Ridge ordered. "All of you, under the blankets." Marin didn't argue. She helped Clara and Samuel climb into the wooden sled, then climbed in after them. Ridge handed Thomas back to her. The baby was still breathing, still alive, and then threw heavy wool blankets over all of them. "Keep your heads down," he said. "Don't look up. Don't try to see where we're going. Just stay covered." "How far?" Marin asked. "Far enough." He didn't wait for more questions. She heard him climb onto the front of the sled, heard him click his tongue at the horse, and then they were moving. The journey was a nightmare of darkness and cold and motion. Under the blankets, Marin couldn't see anything, could only feel the lurch of the sled over uneven ground, the press of her children's bodies against hers, the shallow rise and fall of Thomas's chest. She lost track of time, lost track of direction, lost track of everything except the need to keep breathing, keep holding on, keep believing that this stranger was taking them somewhere safe. At some point, Samuel began to cry, quiet, hitching sobs that shook his small frame. Marin pulled him closer and pressed her lips to his forehead. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're going to be okay." She didn't know if she was telling the truth or not. She didn't know if she would ever tell the truth again. All she knew was that her son needed to hear those words, and so she said them. "Mama?" Clara's voice was muffled by the blankets. "Is the man going to hurt us?" "No, sweetheart." "How do you know?" Marin thought about the question. She didn't know, not really. She had learned over the past 18 months that the world was full of people who seemed kind but weren't, full of people who offered help with one hand and took everything with the other. Dawes Heller had taught her that. Her own husband's so-called friends had taught her that. The shopkeepers who refused her credit, the churches that turned her away, the neighbors who wouldn't meet her eyes, They had all taught her that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But there was something about Ridge Callahan, something in the way he had looked at her children, the way he had lifted Thomas without hesitation, the way he moved through the storm as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Something that made her believe against all evidence and all experience that he wasn't going to hurt them. "I just know," she told Clara. "Sometimes you have to trust people." The words felt hollow in her mouth, but Clara accepted them, and that was enough. The sled stopped. Marin didn't know how long they had been traveling. It could have been 30 minutes or 3 hours. Time had lost all meaning in the darkness under the blankets. But suddenly, the motion ceased, and she heard Ridge's boots hitting the ground. "Stay there," he called. "I need to open the door." She heard him moving away, heard the creak of hinges, and then he was back. "All right, come on, quickly." Marin threw off the blankets and emerged into a world that was somehow less hostile than before. They were still in the middle of the storm, still surrounded by howling wind and driving snow, but ahead of them was a cabin, a solid, sturdy structure of logs and stone that seemed to defy the blizzard's attempts to destroy it. Light glowed in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney. It looked like salvation. Ridge helped them out of the sled one by one. He carried Thomas again, and Marin didn't protest. She simply took Clara's hand and Samuel's hand and followed him through the snow toward the cabin door. Inside, the warmth hit her like a physical blow. After days of relentless cold, the cabin's heat was almost painful. She staggered, her legs threatening to give out, and Clara caught her arm. "Mama!" "I'm fine." Marin steadied herself. "I'm fine. It's warm." Ridge was already moving, laying Thomas down on a narrow bed in the corner of the cabin. The space was small, one main room with a stone fireplace, a simple kitchen area, the bed, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. It was clearly the home of a man who lived alone, a man who needed nothing more than the basics. "The fire's been burning all day," Ridge said, not looking at her. "It should be hot enough to warm them up, but the little one—" He trailed off. Marin moved to Thomas's side. Her baby's face was still that terrible gray color, his breathing still shallow and weak. She began rubbing his hands, his feet, trying to get blood flowing back into his extremities. "Thomas," she whispered. "Thomas, sweetheart, wake up. Please wake up." "Don't rub too hard." Ridge appeared beside her with a basin of water. "Warming up too fast can cause damage. Here." He dipped a cloth in the water. It was warm, not hot, and pressed it gently against Thomas's forehead. Marin watched him, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to save them, who was now caring for her child with the careful attention of a man who knew what he was doing. "How do you know this?" she asked. "I've seen men freeze before." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Out on the range. You learn what to do, and what not to do." "You're a rancher." "Was." He didn't elaborate. Clara and Samuel had settled on the floor near the fireplace, wrapped in blankets that Ridge had pulled from a chest in the corner. They were watching him with wide, wary eyes, these children who had learned to fear strangers, who had been hurt too many times to trust easily. Ridge seemed to notice their stares. He stood up from Thomas's bedside and looked at them. "Are you hungry?" Clara nodded slowly. Samuel just stared. "I've got broth," Ridge said. "It's not much, but it's hot. That's what matters tonight." He moved to the kitchen area, a simple wood-burning stove with a pot hanging over it, and began ladling liquid into tin cups. Marin watched him, still trying to reconcile the reality of what was happening. An hour ago, she had been certain they would die. Now they were in a warm cabin, with a fire and food, and a man who seemed determined to keep them alive. "Why?" she asked suddenly. Ridge turned. "Why what?" "Why are you helping us? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. You could have just kept riding, left us there." Ridge's expression didn't change. He brought 2 cups of broth to Clara and Samuel, handed them over without ceremony. "Drink slow," he told them. "Too fast and you'll get sick." Then he turned back to Marin. "I could have," he agreed, "left you there, kept riding. Most people would have." "But you didn't." "No, I didn't." "Why?" Ridge was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, but in here it felt distant, a threat that couldn't touch them. Because I found something out there, he said finally. Something that shouldn't exist. What? A woman and 3 children freezing to death in a tent. His voice hardened slightly. That shouldn't exist. Not out here. Not anywhere. And when you see something like that, he shook his head. You don't just ride by. Marin felt tears threatening again. She blinked them back. She had cried too much already, wasted too much precious moisture on grief and fear. She couldn't afford to cry anymore. Thank you, she said. The words felt inadequate, too small for what he had done, but they were all she had. Ridge just nodded. Don't thank me yet. The little one's not out of danger, and the storm... He glanced toward the window, where snow was still piling against the glass. The storm's not letting up anytime soon. How long? Could be hours, could be days. He moved back to the stove, filled another cup with broth, and brought it to her. Drink. You need it as much as they do. Marin took the cup. The warmth seeped into her frozen fingers, and she almost sobbed at how good it felt. Such a simple thing, a cup of hot broth, and yet it was more luxury than she had known in months. What's your name? Ridge asked. Marin. Marin Elwood. And my children, Clara, Samuel, and Thomas. Ridge Callahan. I know. At his questioning look, she managed a weak smile. You told me. On the way here. Did I? He seemed surprised. Storm must be getting to me. Usually don't talk that much. Despite everything, the fear, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, Marin felt something loosen in her chest. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close. You don't seem like a man who talks much, she agreed. No, I don't. Ridge pulled up one of the wooden chairs and sat down heavily. For the first time, Marin got a good look at him. He was younger than she had thought. Maybe 30, maybe a few years older. His face was weathered and hard, marked by sun and wind and what she suspected was a lifetime of difficult choices. A scar ran along his jawline, just visible beneath his beard. His eyes were the color of winter ice, pale blue, cold, and unreadable. But there was something in those eyes, something that spoke of kindness buried deep beneath layers of stone. You should rest, he said. All of you. I'll watch the little one. I can't. You can. And you need to. His voice brooked no argument. When's the last time you slept? Real sleep. Not just closing your eyes and waiting for morning. Marin tried to remember. The days and nights had blurred together into one long, desperate struggle for survival. She couldn't recall the last time she had actually slept, truly slept, without waking every few minutes to check on the children, to listen for approaching danger. I don't know, she admitted. Then rest. I'll wake you if anything changes. She wanted to argue. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to stay awake, to keep watch over her children. But her body was shutting down, demanding the sleep it had been denied for too long. And there was something about Ridge, something steady and solid and reliable, that made her believe he would do exactly what he said. If Thomas, I'll wake you, Ridge repeated. I give you my word. Marin looked at her children. Clara and Samuel had finished their broth and were already drifting toward sleep, curled up together near the fire. Thomas was still unconscious, but his breathing seemed slightly stronger, or maybe that was just hope talking. Okay, she said finally, I'll rest, but not for long. As long as you need. Ridge stood and moved toward Thomas's bedside, settling into a chair there with the watchful patience of a man who was used to long vigils. Marin lowered herself to the floor near her other 2 children, pulled a blanket around her shoulders, and let exhaustion claim her. She woke to the sound of crying. For a terrifying moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was wrong. The walls were wrong. Everything was wrong. And then memory crashed back, the storm, the stranger, the cabin, and she was on her feet before she was fully conscious. Thomas! But it wasn't Thomas crying, it was Thomas laughing. Her 4-year-old sat up in the bed where Ridge had laid him, his face still pale, but his eyes bright with life. Ridge was beside him, holding a spoon and a cup, and the big cowboy's expression was something close to amusement. Told you the broth was good, Ridge was saying. Better than your mama's, probably. Is not, Thomas protested, giggling. Mama's is best. Marin's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the floor, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Her baby was alive. Her baby was awake. Her baby was laughing. Ridge looked over at her. His expression softened slightly, just a flicker, barely noticeable. Told you I'd wake you if anything changed. You did. Maren couldn't stop the tears, didn't want to stop them. You did. Thank you. Thank you. She scrambled to her feet and rushed to the bed, pulling Thomas into her arms. He squirmed and complained, "Mama, you're squishing me." But she didn't let go. She held him and cried and thanked God and thanked Ridge and thanked whoever or whatever had brought this stranger to them in their darkest hour. Clara and Samuel crowded around too, hugging their little brother, laughing and crying at the same time. For a few precious minutes, the cabin was filled with the chaotic joy of a family reunited, a family that had been on the edge of death and had somehow, impossibly, survived. Ridge stood back, watching them. His face had returned to its usual unreadable mask, but there was something in his posture, a looseness, perhaps, or a lessening of tension, that suggested he was not entirely unmoved by the scene. "How long was I asleep?" Maren finally asked, wiping her eyes. "About 6 hours. Storm's still going, but it's weakening, should blow itself out by morning." 6 hours? She shook her head in disbelief. "I don't think I've slept 6 hours in a row since my husband died." Ridge's expression didn't change. "When was that?" 18 months ago. Fever took him." Maren settled Thomas back on the bed and pulled the blankets around him. "We had a farm. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. At least we thought it was. After Daniel died, I found out he'd taken out loans I didn't know about. We lost everything. And ended up out here in the middle of a blizzard with nothing but a tent? It's a long story. We've got time." Maren looked at him. At this man who had saved her family, who had asked nothing in return, who was now offering to listen to her story as if he actually cared about the answer. She realized with something like shock that she wanted to tell him, wanted to explain how she had ended up here, on the edge of death, with 3 children depending on her. Wanted someone, anyone, to understand what she had been through. "All right," she said, "I'll tell you. But first, is there more broth? I think my other 2 could use some too." Ridge nodded and moved toward the stove. "There's plenty. Sit, all of you. And then, Mrs. Elwood, you can tell me how you ended up freezing to death on my land." "After Daniel died, the bank took the farm," Maren began. "Every acre, every animal, every piece of furniture. They left us with the clothes on our backs and not much else." She was sitting at the wooden table now, a cup of broth warming her hands. Clara and Samuel sat on the bed with Thomas, all 3 of them eating slowly, their color improving with every spoonful. Ridge sat across from her, his own cup untouched. "I tried to find work," she continued, "anywhere that would take a woman with 3 children, but nobody wanted us. Too much trouble, too many mouths to feed. Finally, I heard about a man named Dawes Heller. He ran a big operation about 50 miles east of here. Cattle, mostly, but also some farming. He said he needed workers, and he didn't care if they were women or children, room, board, and wages." "Dawes Heller," Ridge's voice was flat. "I know that name." "Then you know what kind of man he is." "I've heard stories." Maren's hands tightened around her cup. "The stories don't do him justice. He worked us like animals, 16 hours a day, sometimes more. The children, too. Clara was in the fields from sunup to sundown. Samuel helped with the cattle, even though he was too young and too small. And the wages he promised?" She laughed bitterly. "They never came. Every month there was some new expense that ate up what we were owed. Food costs, housing costs, equipment costs. After 6 months, I realized we weren't working for wages. We were working to pay off a debt that kept growing no matter how hard we tried." "Debt slavery," Ridge said quietly. "That's exactly what it was. But I didn't know what to do. We had nowhere else to go. And Dawes made it very clear what would happen if we tried to leave." Her voice wavered. "He said he'd have me arrested for theft. Said he'd take the children and put them in a workhouse. Said—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "Said what?" Maren looked at her children. They were focused on their food, not listening, or at least pretending not to listen. She lowered her voice. He said if I gave him what he wanted, he might reconsider our arrangement. Ridge's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went cold. Very cold. I refused, Marin said. Obviously. And after that, things got worse. Less food, more work, longer hours. He was punishing me, making an example. She took a shaky breath. Finally, I decided we had to run. I didn't care about the consequences anymore. Anything was better than staying there. So you ran, in the middle of winter. I didn't have a choice. Dawes was planning something. I could see it in the way he looked at me, the way his men watched the children. If we didn't leave then, we never would. She shook her head. I stole a tent, some blankets, a little bit of food, took the children and walked out in the middle of the night. I thought, she laughed again, hollow and sad. I thought we would find help, find someone willing to take us in. I didn't realize how alone we really were. The storm. The storm came out of nowhere. 1 minute the sky was clear, the next, she gestured helplessly. We couldn't find shelter, couldn't find anyone. All we could do was keep walking, keep hoping, keep praying that something would save us. She looked at Ridge. And then you came. Ridge was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had indeed grown quieter, still present, still powerful, but no longer the screaming monster it had been hours ago. Dawes Heller, Ridge said finally. He's about 50 miles east, you said? Give or take. And he thinks you owe him money. He thinks I owe him everything. But Ridge... Marin leaned forward. It's not true. We don't owe him anything. We worked off whatever debt there ever was a dozen times over. He just kept adding more, kept inventing new expenses, kept... I believe you. The simple statement stopped her mid-sentence. You do? I told you, I've heard stories about Dawes Heller. Ridge's jaw tightened. Man's been pulling that scheme for years. Brings in desperate people, works them half to death, tells them they owe him so much they can never leave. Nobody does anything because he's got connections in town. Sheriff, judge, the whole lot of them. Then how do we... Marin's voice dropped to a whisper. How do I keep my family safe? If he finds us, he won't. You don't know that. He has men, resources. Mrs. Elwood. Ridge's voice was calm, steady. Let me tell you something about this cabin. It's been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built it, my father expanded it, and I've lived here alone for the past 10 years. In all that time, not once has anyone come here uninvited. Not trappers, not rustlers, not Indians, not law. Nobody. He paused. And nobody will. Not as long as you're under my roof. But Marin stared at him. Why would you do this for us? You don't know us. We're nothing to you. You're something, Ridge said quietly. You're people. And people don't deserve to be treated like cattle. He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Get some more rest, all of you. Storm should be over by morning. Then we'll figure out what comes next. He moved toward the door, grabbing his coat from a hook on the wall. Where are you going? Marin asked. Need to check on the horse, make sure the sled is secure. He paused at the door, looked back at her. Lock this behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. How will I know it's you? I'll knock 3 times. Pause. Then 2 more. He pulled on his coat. Anyone else tries to come in, you take the children and hide in the root cellar. Trapdoors under the rug by the fireplace. Marin's blood ran cold. You think Dawes might come? Tonight? No, but I didn't think I'd find a woman and 3 kids freezing to death on my property either. Ridge opened the door, letting in a gust of bitter wind. Always better to be ready for what you don't expect. And then he was gone, swallowed by the storm. Marin sat there for a long moment, staring at the closed door. Then, slowly, she stood up and crossed to it. Her fingers found the heavy iron lock, a lock that looked like it could withstand a battering ram, and she slid it into place. Behind her, Clara spoke. Mama, is everything going to be okay? Marin turned. Her daughter was watching her with eyes too old for an 11-year-old, eyes that had seen too much hardship and too little joy. Yes, sweetheart. Marin walked back to the bed and sat down beside her children. I think it might be. She pulled all three of them close, feeling their warmth, their heartbeats, their breath. They were alive. Against all odds, against all reason, they were alive. And for the first time in 18 months, Marin Elwood allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But the hours passed slowly in the little cabin. Ridge returned from checking on the horse, knocking exactly as he had said he would, 3 times, then a pause, then 2 more. Marin unlocked the door and let him in, snow swirling around his shoulders. Horse is fine, he reported, stamping his boots on the floor. Storm's definitely weakening, should be clear by dawn. Thank God. Ridge hung up his coat and moved to the fire, adding another log. The flames crackled and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the walls. You should sleep again, he said without looking at her. All of you. It's been a hard few days. I don't think I can. Marin sat back down at the table. Too much in my head. Ridge glanced at her, then nodded once. He pulled out the other chair and sat across from her, the firelight playing across his weathered features. Then we'll sit, he said simply. They sat in silence for a while. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the silence of 2 people who have been through something together and don't need words to fill the space. The children slept behind them, soft breathing sounds mixing with the crackle of the fire. Finally, Marin spoke. What happened to you? Ridge raised an eyebrow. You said you used to be a rancher, past tense, and you live out here alone, in the middle of nowhere with no family, no, she gestured vaguely, no anything. Something happened. Ridge was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. I had a wife once, Rebecca, and a son, Michael. What happened to them? Fever. Same as your husband, probably. Came through the territory about 12 years ago. Killed half the settlement. His jaw tightened. Killed them. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Does that make it easier? Ridge looked at her, really looked, for the first time since they'd sat down. His eyes, usually so cold and guarded, showed something deeper, something painful. No, he admitted. It doesn't. Marin reached across the table and touched his hand, just briefly, just lightly. A human connection in the midst of all this cold. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Ridge didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. They sat there together as the storm slowly died outside, 2 broken people who had found each other in the darkness, neither one knowing what the morning would bring. Dawn broke clear and bright over the Dakota plains. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Everything was white. The ground, the trees, the distant hills. Snow sparkled under the rising sun like a sea of diamonds, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Marin stood at the cabin's single window, watching the light spread across the landscape. Behind her, the children were still sleeping, truly sleeping now, the deep and restful sleep of people who no longer feared they would freeze to death before morning. Ridge came to stand beside her. Beautiful, isn't it? He said. Yes, and terrifying. That's the prairie for you, always both at once. Marin turned to look at him. In the morning light, he seemed somehow different, softer perhaps, though that wasn't quite the right word. Human. That was it. He seemed human in a way he hadn't the night before. What happens now? She asked. Now, Ridge considered the question. Now we figure out what to do with you and those kids. We can't stay here forever. No, you can't. He paused. But you can stay for now. Until the snow clears, at least. Until we figure out something better. And Dawes? Ridge's expression hardened. Dawes Heller isn't going to be a problem for much longer. What do you mean? I mean I'm going to ride into town tomorrow, talk to some people, see what can be done about a man who keeps workers in debt slavery and threatens to take children from their mothers. The sheriff's in Heller's pocket. I know, but there are others who aren't. Federal marshal's been making noise about corruption in these parts. Might be time to give him something to investigate. Marin felt a flicker of hope. The first real hope she'd felt in months. You would do that? For us? Ridge was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, he said, I told you last night. What I found out there in the storm, a mother and 3 children, freezing to death, that shouldn't exist. It's wrong. And I've spent too many years not doing anything about the wrong things in this world. He looked at her. Maybe it's time to start. Marin didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. She just looked at this strange, solitary man who had come out of nowhere to save her family, and she felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't love, not yet. She didn't know him well enough for that. But it was trust. Real trust, the kind she hadn't felt since Daniel died. And in a world as cold and hard as the Dakota Plains, trust was worth more than gold. The morning passed quietly. Ridge cooked breakfast, bacon and eggs and fresh bread that he had apparently baked himself. And the children ate like they hadn't seen food in weeks, which, Marin reflected, wasn't far from the truth. After breakfast, Ridge showed them around the cabin property. There was a small barn for the horse, a root cellar stocked with preserved food, a woodshed piled high with firewood. You built all this yourself? Clara asked, wide-eyed. Most of it. My father built the original cabin. I added the rest over the years. It's amazing. Ridge almost smiled. It's home. Samuel, who had barely spoken since the storm, tugged on Ridge's sleeve. Mr. Callahan? Just Ridge. Ridge. Samuel hesitated. Are we safe here? Really safe? Ridge crouched down to the boy's level, his voice gentle. You're safe here, son. I promise you that. But the bad men aren't going to hurt you, not while I'm around. And I'm going to be around for a while yet. Ridge placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. You believe me? Samuel looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Good. Ridge stood up. Now, who wants to help me feed the horse? Both boys shouted, Me! At the same time, and for a moment the air was filled with something Marin hadn't heard in far too long. Laughter. Real, genuine, childhood laughter. She watched Ridge lead the children toward the barn, their small figures dwarfed by his tall frame, and she felt tears prick her eyes again. Maybe it's going to be all right, she thought. Maybe, for the first time in 18 months, things are finally going to be all right. That evening, as the sun began to set and the temperature dropped once more, they all gathered around the fire. Ridge had pulled out a battered deck of cards, and he was teaching the children a game called poker, though he assured Marin they were only playing for matchsticks. Full house, Clara crowed, slapping her cards down. That's not a full house, Samuel protested. You need 3 of one kind and 2 of another. I have that. Those are all different. Ridge watched them argue with something almost like amusement on his face. Marin, sitting nearby with Thomas dozing in her lap, found herself watching him instead of the game. You're good with them, she said softly. Ridge glanced at her. They're good kids. I know, but not everyone sees that. Most people just see extra mouths to feed, problems, burdens. Those people are fools. Maybe. But there are a lot of fools in this world. Ridge was quiet for a moment. Then unexpectedly he said, Michael would have been about Samuel's age now, if he'd lived. Marin's heart clenched. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's not your burden to carry. He paused. I watch your boy, and I think about all the things my son never got to do, never got to learn, never got to become. He shook his head. Seems wrong, somehow, that some children get to grow up and others don't. It is wrong. All of it is wrong. The sickness, the cruelty, the poverty. Marin looked down at Thomas, his small face peaceful in sleep. But we can't control any of that. All we can do is protect the ones we love and hope it's enough. Is it? Ridge asked. Ever enough? I don't know. Marin met his eyes. Ask me again in 20 years. Ridge almost smiled. Almost. I might just do that. Night fell, and with it came the cold. Ridge banked the fire high and made sure the cabin was secure. The children were arranged on the bed, all 3 of them now, huddled together like puppies, while Marin took the floor near the fireplace. Ridge sat in his chair by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness. You should sleep, Marin said. I'll sleep tomorrow. Tonight, I watch. Watch for what? Anything. Ridge's voice was quiet but firm. I told you before. I like to be ready for what I don't expect. Marin wanted to argue, but she knew it would be pointless. This was a man who had lived alone for a decade, who had survived everything the Dakota Territory could throw at him. He knew what he was doing. Thank you, she said again. Ridge nodded once, acknowledging the words, then returned his gaze to the window. And Marin, surrounded by her sleeping children, protected by a man she had known less than a day, finally closed her eyes and let sleep claim her. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in the endless winter sky, and the frozen plains lay silent under a blanket of new snow. For now, they were safe. But the storm was not the only danger on the Dakota Plains, and somewhere, 50 miles to the east, Dawes Heller was just learning that his property had escaped. The real test was yet to come. 3 days passed in the small cabin, and each one felt like a gift stolen from the jaws of winter itself. The snow had stopped falling, but the drifts remained, some of them reaching nearly to the cabin's windows, transforming the landscape into an endless white sea that sparkled under the cold January sun. Ridge had cleared a path to the barn and the woodshed, his shovel biting into the frozen powder with the steady rhythm of a man who had done this work countless times before. The children watched him from the window, their breath fogging the glass, their eyes following his every movement with a mixture of fascination and something that looked almost like worship. Marin understood that look. She felt it herself, though she tried to push it down, tried to remind herself that gratitude was not the same as affection, that this man was a stranger despite everything he had done for them. But it was difficult to maintain that distance when she watched him carry extra firewood inside so the children wouldn't have to go out in the cold. Difficult when she saw him patiently teaching Samuel how to whittle a small wooden horse from a piece of scrap pine. Difficult when she noticed the way his eyes softened, just slightly, just for a moment, when Thomas climbed into his lap to examine the buttons on his shirt. Ridge Callahan was not a soft man. That much was obvious. His hands were calloused and scarred, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind and hard living. He spoke sparingly, moved deliberately, and carried himself with the coiled alertness of someone who had learned the hard way that danger could come from anywhere at any time. But beneath all of that hardness, Marin was beginning to glimpse something else, something gentle, something wounded, something that recognized the pain in her own heart because it lived in his as well. On the morning of the 4th day, Ridge announced that he was riding into town. Town? Marin looked up from the pot of oatmeal she was stirring. In this weather? Snow's packed down enough for the horse to manage, and we need supplies. Ridge pulled on his heavy coat, checking the pockets with practiced efficiency. More importantly, I need to talk to some people about your situation. The federal marshal you mentioned? Among others. Ridge's jaw tightened. Dawes Heller's been operating too long without anyone pushing back. Time that changed. Marin set down the wooden spoon and crossed to where he stood by the door. The children were still sleeping. Thomas's illness had left him weaker than the others, and he needed more rest, so she kept her voice low. What if he finds out where we are? What if someone tells him? No one knows you're here. And even if they did, Ridge met her eyes. I told you before, Mrs. Elwood, no one comes to this cabin uninvited. But you'll be gone. If something happens while you're away, nothing's going to happen. Ridge reached into his coat and pulled out a revolver, a heavy, well-maintained weapon that gleamed dully in the morning light. You know how to use one of these? Marin hesitated. Daniel taught me, years ago. Good. Ridge pressed the gun into her hands. There's a rifle above the fireplace, too, loaded. Safety's on. He paused, studying her face. I wouldn't leave if I thought you were in danger. But I need to do this. The longer we wait, the more time Heller has to figure out where you went. Marin looked down at the revolver. It was heavier than she remembered, cold and foreign in her grip. But there was something reassuring about the weight of it, something that whispered, you can protect them, you can keep them safe. How long will you be gone? Day and a half, maybe 2, depending on the roads. Ridge pulled his hat down low over his eyes. Keep the doors locked. Don't open them for anyone. If someone comes, anyone at all, you take the children and hide in the root cellar. There's food and water down there, enough for a few days. And if you don't come back? The question hung in the air between them. Ridge's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been surprise or might have been something else entirely. "I'll come back," he said quietly. "I give you my word." He held her gaze for a long moment, and Marin felt that strange shifting sensation in her chest again, that feeling of trust building where trust had no right to exist. Then Ridge nodded once, opened the door, and stepped out into the frozen morning. Marin watched him walk toward the barn, his tall figure cutting a dark line against the brilliant white of the snow. She watched him saddle the horse, check the saddlebags, mount up with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. And she watched him ride away, growing smaller and smaller, until finally he disappeared over a distant rise and was gone. The cabin felt emptier without him. Marin stood at the window for a long time after he left, the revolver still clutched in her hands, her heart beating with a fear she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just fear of Dawes Heller, though that was part of it. It wasn't just fear of being alone, though that was part of it too. It was something deeper, something more fundamental, a fear that this fragile moment of safety would shatter like ice under a boot heel, leaving her and her children back where they had been 4 days ago, freezing, alone, dying. "Mama?" She turned. Clara stood in the doorway to the sleeping area, rubbing her eyes, her hair tangled from sleep. "Where's Mr. Callahan?" "He went to town. He'll be back in a day or two." Clara's eyes widened. "He left us?" "Just for a little while, sweetheart. He needs to get supplies. And he's going to try to help us, to make sure the bad men can't hurt us anymore." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then she asked, very softly, "Do you trust him, Mama?" Marin thought about the question, thought about everything she had learned over the past 18 months, about betrayal and cruelty and the countless ways that people could hurt each other. Thought about Daniel's so-called friends who had abandoned her, about Dawes Heller who had enslaved her, about all the shopkeepers and neighbors and strangers who had turned their backs when she needed help most. And then she thought about Ridge, about the way he had lifted Thomas from her arms without hesitation, the way he had stayed awake all night to watch over them, the way he looked at her children, not as burdens, not as problems, but as people deserving of protection and care. "Yes," she said finally. "I do." Clara nodded slowly. "I do too." The simple statement, coming from her daughter, who had every reason to distrust the world, meant more to Marin than she could express. She crossed the room and pulled Clara into a hug, holding her tight. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "I promise." And for the first time in a very long time, she actually believed it. The day passed slowly without Ridge's presence to anchor it. Marin kept the children occupied as best she could, playing cards, telling stories, teaching them letters and numbers with a piece of charcoal and a flat piece of wood. Thomas was feeling better, well enough to play with the wooden horse that Ridge had helped Samuel carve, galloping it across the floor with sound effects that made his siblings laugh. But even as she went through the motions of normalcy, Marin couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She found herself checking the windows constantly, peering out at the empty white landscape, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The revolver stayed within arm's reach at all times, and more than once she caught herself reaching for it at the slightest unexpected noise. Night fell early, as it did in winter, and with it came the cold. Marin built up the fire and settled the children into bed, then took up Ridge's post by the window. She had no intention of sleeping, not with him gone, not with the possibility of danger lurking somewhere in the darkness. The hours crawled by. The fire crackled. The children's breathing deepened into the slow rhythm of sleep, and Marin sat in the darkness, watching and waiting, the revolver heavy in her lap. Somewhere around midnight, she heard it. Hoofbeats. At first she thought she was imagining things, her exhausted mind playing tricks on her. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. Multiple horses, approaching from the east, moving fast. Marin's blood turned to ice. Ridge had gone west toward town. Anyone coming from the east? She was on her feet before she finished the thought, crossing to the bed where the children slept. "Clara! Samuel! Wake up!" Her voice was low and urgent. "Wake up now!" Clara's eyes snapped open immediately. "Mama? What?" "Quiet. Get your brother." We need to hide." To her credit, Clara didn't argue or ask questions. She simply shook Samuel awake while Marin scooped Thomas into her arms. The boy stirred, mumbled something unintelligible, then settled against her chest without fully waking. "The root cellar," Marin whispered. "Remember what Mr. Callahan said. Come on." She led them to the fireplace, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The rug. Ridge had said the trap door was under the rug. She kicked it aside with her foot, revealing a wooden hatch set into the floor. "Down! Quickly!" Clara went first, disappearing into the darkness below. Samuel followed, his face pale with fear, but his movement steady. Marin handed Thomas down to them, then grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace and climbed down herself, pulling the hatch closed behind her. The root cellar was pitch black and freezing cold, but it was also solid. Walls of packed earth reinforced with timber, a space designed to withstand whatever the Dakota Territory could throw at it. Marin gathered the children close, pressing them against her body, and waited. Above them the hoofbeats stopped. Voices. Men's voices, muffled by the floor but unmistakably there. How many? 2? 3? More? "Spread out. Check the barn." Marin's grip on the rifle tightened. That voice. She knew that voice. Dawes Heller. He had found them. "Cabin's locked up tight, boss." A different voice, closer to the door. "Want me to break it down?" "Not yet. Check around first. See if there's another way in." Footsteps, heavy boots crunching through snow. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, circling the cabin, probing for weaknesses, hunting. Thomas stirred in Clara's arms. "Mama? What's happening?" "Shh, baby. You have to be very quiet. Can you do that for Mama?" Thomas nodded, his eyes wide and frightened in the darkness. Marin pressed a finger to her lips, and he pressed his small hand over his mouth, understanding the game even if he didn't understand the stakes. Above them, something crashed, the sound of splintering wood, of a door being forced open, heavy boots on the cabin floor. "Well, well," Dawes Heller's voice, now clear and close. "Looks like someone's been living here. Fire's still warm." "You think it's them, boss?" "Who else would it be? Nobody lives out here except that Callahan hermit, and he doesn't entertain guests." A pause. "Search the place. They're here somewhere." The footsteps spread out, moving through the cabin. Marin heard drawers being opened, furniture being moved, Ridge's few possessions being carelessly tossed aside. She held her breath, her arms wrapped around her children, the rifle clutched against her chest. "They're going to find the hatch," she thought. "They're going to find us." But the minutes stretched on, and the hatch remained closed. The men searched above them, cursing and grumbling, but somehow, impossibly, they didn't find the entrance to the root cellar. "Nothing, boss," the second voice again. "Place is empty." "They were here. Look at the beds. 4 people were sleeping in them. A woman and 3 kids, just like Burroughs said. Maybe they ran when they heard us coming. In the middle of the night? In this cold? With 3 children?" Dawes laughed, an ugly, mirthless sound. "No, they're here, hiding somewhere." More footsteps, more searching, and then, directly above where Marin crouched with her children, the sound of boots stopping. "What's this rug doing here? Fireplace rugs don't go in the middle of the floor." Marin's heart stopped. "Move it." The scrape of fabric against wood. And then silence. "Well, well." Dawes's voice was triumphant. "Look what we have here." The hatch opened. Light flooded in, lantern light, harsh and yellow, and Marin found herself staring up into the face of the man who had tormented her family for 6 months. Dawes Heller was exactly as she remembered him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if it hadn't been twisted by cruelty. His eyes were small and mean, his smile the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Hello, Mrs. Elwood. Did you really think you could run from me?" Marin raised the rifle. Dawes's smile didn't waver. Now, let's not do anything foolish. You pull that trigger, my boys put holes in all 4 of you before you can chamber another round." He gestured to the men flanking him, 2 rough-looking characters with revolvers already drawn. "Why don't you come up out of there, nice and easy, and we'll have ourselves a little conversation." "I'm not going anywhere with you." "Mrs. Elwood," Dawes's voice hardened, "you owe me money. A lot of money. You ran out on your debt and stole my property in the process. Now I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to forget about all that. The money, the theft, even this little escape attempt. If you just come back with me right now. We don't owe you anything. We worked off whatever debt there ever was a dozen times over. That's not how I see it. And more importantly, that's not how the law sees it. Dawes's smile returned. I've got papers, Mrs. Elwood. Contracts, documents, everything legal and proper. You bring this to a judge and he'll side with me. He always does. Marin's grip on the rifle didn't waver. I'd rather die than go back to that place. Would you? Dawes tilted his head. What about your children? Would you rather they die too? The question hung in the air like poison. Behind her, Marin felt Clara press closer, felt Thomas whimper softly against his sister's shoulder. These were her children, her babies. She would do anything to protect them, anything at all. But going back to Dawes Heller wasn't protection. It was a death sentence, just slower and more painful. Let me make this simple for you, Dawes said. You can come with me willingly, and I'll forget about all the trouble you've caused. We'll go back to the farm, you'll work off your debt like you should have done in the first place, and eventually, you'll earn your freedom. Or, he drew his own revolver and pointed it at her head. You can refuse, and I'll take the children anyway. They're young. They can work. You, on the other hand, are starting to be more trouble than you're worth. You wouldn't. Wouldn't I? Dawes's eyes glittered in the lantern light. You don't know me as well as you think you do, Mrs. Elwood. I've done things that would make you sick, things that keep other men awake at night. What's one more body in the snow? He cocked the revolver. Last chance. What's it going to be? Marin looked at her children, at Clara, who was trying so hard to be brave despite the terror in her eyes, at Samuel, who had his arms wrapped around Thomas, shielding his little brother with his own body, at Thomas, who was crying silently, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. She thought about Ridge, about his promise to come back, his assurance that no one would hurt them while she was under his roof. But Ridge wasn't here. Ridge was miles away in town, talking to people who might or might not be able to help. And even if he rode back this very moment, he would arrive too late. This was her fight. Hers alone. Okay, she heard herself say. Okay, I'll come with you. Dawes smiled. Smart woman. He reached down to help her out of the cellar, and Marin made her move. She swung the rifle up and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. Dawes screamed, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had torn through flesh and muscle. He staggered backward, knocking into one of his men, and Marin was already moving, shoving past them, the rifle abandoned, the revolver in her hand now. Run, she screamed at her children. Clara, take your brothers and run. But there was nowhere to run. The second man grabbed her before she could take 3 steps, his arm locking around her throat, the cold barrel of his gun pressing against her temple. Drop it, he snarled. Drop it or I'll paint the walls with your brains. Marin's fingers opened. The revolver clattered to the floor. Dawes was on his feet again, his face contorted with rage, blood streaming from his wounded shoulder. He crossed to Marin in 2 strides and backhanded her across the face, a blow so hard that her vision went white, and her ears rang. You stupid, stupid woman, he hissed. You think you can fight me? You think you can win? He hit her again and again until she sagged in his man's grip, barely conscious. I was going to let you live. I was going to be merciful. But now? He leaned in close, his breath hot against her face. Now I'm going to make you watch while I work your children to death. Every day for the rest of your miserable life, you'll see them suffer. And you'll know it's your fault. Please, Marin whispered, please. They're just children. They're property. My property. And property doesn't get to have opinions. Dawes straightened and turned to his men. Get them out of here, all of them. We're leaving. The man holding Marin started to drag her toward the door. The other moved toward the root cellar, where the children were still hiding, too terrified to move. And then, from somewhere outside, a voice rang out. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Everyone froze. The voice was calm, steady, utterly devoid of fear. A voice that Marin knew. A voice that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Ridge Callahan stepped through the cabin door. He was covered in snow, his coat crusted with ice, his hat pulled low over his eyes. In his hands was a shotgun. Not the rifle from above the fireplace, but something bigger, meaner, with twin barrels that gleamed in the lantern light. "Let her go," Ridge said. Dawes recovered first. Well, the hermit himself. I was wondering when you'd show up." He gestured to his men. "Shoot him." Neither man moved. Ridge smiled, a cold, hard smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your boys are smarter than you are, Heller. They know what this gun can do at close range. They know that even if they manage to kill me, I'll take at least one of them with me." He shifted the shotgun slightly, the barrels moving from one man to the other. "So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to let Mrs. Elwood go. You're going to leave my cabin, and you're going to ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Tonight. And if I don't, then I'll kill all three of you." Ridge's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "And I'll do it without losing a minute of sleep." Dawes laughed. "You think you scare me? I've got connections, Callahan. Sheriff, judge, half the businessmen in the territory. You kill me, and you'll hang for it." "Maybe. But you'll still be dead." The two men stared at each other. Dawes with his bloody shoulder and his mean little eyes, Ridge with his shotgun and his winter-cold gaze. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on, and Marin could see the calculations happening behind Dawes's face. Could he win this fight? Was it worth the risk? "The woman owes me money," Dawes said finally. "She and her brats worked for me, and they ran out on their debt. I've got every legal right to bring them back." "You've got papers, you mean?" "Papers that'll hold up in court." "Maybe." Ridge's expression didn't change. "But I've got papers too. Sent a wire to the federal marshal this afternoon. Told him all about your operation, the debt slavery, the abuse, the workers who tried to leave and never made it home. He was very interested." Something flickered in Dawes's eyes. Fear? Uncertainty? It was gone before Marin could identify it, replaced by his usual arrogant sneer. "That's hearsay. You've got nothing but the word of a hysterical woman." "I've got more than that." Ridge's smile widened slightly. "I've got Marcus Cole." The name hit Dawes like a physical blow. His face went pale, his wounded shoulder forgotten. "Cole's dead." "No, he's not. He's in town right now, talking to anyone who'll listen about what you did to him and his family. About how you worked his wife to death and sold his children to a factory in the East." Ridge paused. "You should have made sure he was dead, Heller. Sloppy." Dawes was silent for a long moment. His men exchanged nervous glances, their guns wavering. The whole dynamic of the room had shifted. Ridge was no longer the outgunned defender, but something far more dangerous. A man with leverage. A man with a plan. "This isn't over," Dawes said finally. "No, it's not. But it's over for tonight." Ridge gestured with the shotgun. "Tell your boy to let her go. Now." Dawes nodded to the man holding Marin. The arm around her throat loosened, and she stumbled forward, gasping for breath. Ridge caught her with his free hand, steadying her, his eyes never leaving Dawes. "Get your children," he said quietly. "Take them to the bedroom. Lock the door." Marin wanted to argue, wanted to stay, to fight, to make sure this monster who had tormented her family couldn't hurt them anymore. But she saw the look in Ridge's eyes and understood. This wasn't over. But the children needed to be safe first. She crossed to the root cellar and helped Clara, Samuel, and Thomas climb out. All three of them were crying, shaking with fear, but they followed her without question as she led them to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. She closed the door, locked it, and pulled them all into her arms. "It's okay," she whispered. "It's okay. He's here. We're safe." Through the door she could hear voices, Ridge and Dawes still talking, though she couldn't make out the words. And then, finally, the sound of boots moving toward the cabin door, the creak of hinges, the howl of wind, and then silence. A knock on the bedroom door 3 times, a pause, then 2 more. Marin's hands were shaking as she unlocked the door. Ridge stood on the other side, the shotgun resting easy in his hands, his expression unreadable. "They're gone." Marin let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Are you sure?" "I watched them right away. They won't be back tonight." "But tomorrow I'll deal with." Ridge set the shotgun aside and crouched down to the children's level. Thomas immediately launched himself at the cowboy. wrapping his small arms around Ridge's neck and burying his face in his shoulder. Ridge hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of surprise perhaps, or something deeper, and then his arms came up to hold the boy. "You're okay," he said softly. "All of you. You're okay." Clara was crying too now, the brave front she had maintained finally crumbling. Samuel stood frozen, his face white, his whole body trembling. Marin gathered them both close, and for a long moment they all stood there, a makeshift family clinging to each other in the aftermath of terror. "I thought you weren't coming back," Marin said finally. "I thought you were gone, and they found us, and I turned around." Ridge's voice was quiet. "Got maybe 5 miles toward town, and something told me to come back. Couldn't explain it, just a feeling. A feeling. Call it instinct, call it whatever you want." He shifted Thomas to his other arm and met Marin's eyes. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. I'm sorry they got in." "You saved us." Marin shook her head. "You came back and you saved us. There's nothing to apologize for." Ridge looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his winter-cold eyes. Something warming, something human. "Come on," he said finally. "Let's get these kids back to bed. We've got a lot to figure out in the morning." The rest of the night passed in a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. Ridge repaired the broken door as best he could, reinforced it with boards and nails until it was stronger than before. He built up the fire until the cabin was almost too warm, then settled into his chair by the window with the shotgun across his knees. Marin tried to stay awake, tried to keep watch, to help protect her family, but her body had other ideas. The terror of the past few hours, combined with days of accumulated exhaustion, finally caught up with her. She fell asleep on the floor near the fireplace. Her children gathered around her and didn't wake until morning. When she opened her eyes, sunlight was streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee filled the cabin. Ridge was at the stove, his back to her, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been up for hours. "The children?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "Still sleeping. I didn't want to wake them." Ridge poured a cup of coffee and brought it to her. "You should drink this. We need to talk." Marin sat up, accepting the cup gratefully. The coffee was strong and hot, and it helped clear the fog from her mind. "Heller's going to come back," she said. It wasn't a question. "Probably. He's not the kind of man who gives up easily." Ridge sat down across from her, his own cup cradled in his hands. "But he's also not stupid. What I told him last night, about Marcus Cole, about the federal marshal, that's all true. I did send that wire. And Cole is in town, talking to anyone who'll listen. So there's hope? Real hope?" "There's always hope." Ridge paused, his eyes distant. "But hope isn't a plan. We need to think about what comes next, what you want to do, where you want to go." Marin was quiet for a moment, turning the question over in her mind. For so long, her only goal had been survival, getting through one more day, one more week, one more month. She hadn't allowed herself to think about the future, about what her life might look like if she actually managed to escape Dawes Heller's grip. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't have anywhere to go. No family left, no friends who'd take us in. Everything we had, Dawes took. You could stay here." The words hung in the air between them. Marin looked up, startled, and found Ridge watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Here? It's not much. 1 room, barely enough space for 1 person, let alone 5, but—" He trailed off, seeming to search for words. "I've got land, enough to build another room, maybe 2, if we work through spring. And the children—" Something softened in his face. "They deserve stability. A home. Not another wagon ride to another place that might not want them. Why would you do this? We're strangers. Burdens." "You keep saying that." Ridge's voice was quiet but firm. "You keep expecting me to see you as a burden. But that's not what I see, Mrs. Elwood." "What do you see?" Ridge was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. "I see a woman who walked into a blizzard with 3 children rather than let them be destroyed by a monster. I see a mother who held her dying baby in her arms and didn't give up, even when giving up would have been easier." He met her eyes. I see someone worth protecting, someone worth fighting for. Marin felt tears pricking at her eyes. She blinked them back, but they fell anyway, sliding down her cheeks, dripping onto her hands. You don't know me. No, I don't. Ridge set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. But I'd like to, if you'll let me. It wasn't a declaration of love, it wasn't a proposal or a promise. It was something simpler, something more honest, an offer of time, of patience, of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, two broken people could help each other heal. Marin wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know how to trust people anymore. I've been hurt too many times. I know, so have I. Ridge reached out and very gently took her hand. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. We don't have to figure everything out today. We don't have to make any decisions right now. Just think about it. That's all I'm asking. Marin looked at their joined hands, his large and scarred, hers small and frostbitten. Such different hands, from such different lives, and yet somehow they fit together. Okay, she said softly. I'll think about it. Ridge nodded once, released her hand, and stood up. I should check on the horse, and we'll need more firewood before tonight. He was already moving toward the door, retreating back into the safety of practicality and work. But before he could reach it, a small voice called out from the bedroom. Mama? Is the bad man gone? Thomas stood in the doorway, his wooden horse clutched in one hand, his eyes still heavy with sleep. Behind him, Clara and Samuel were stirring, beginning to wake. Marin opened her arms, and Thomas ran to her, climbing into her lap and pressing his face against her shoulder. Yes, baby. The bad man is gone. Is Mr. Ridge still here? Yes, he's still here. Thomas relaxed, his small body softening against hers. Good. I like Mr. Ridge. He makes me feel safe. Marin looked up and met Ridge's eyes across the room. He was standing by the door, his coat in his hands, watching them with an expression that broke her heart and healed it at the same time. He makes me feel safe too, she said quietly. And for the first time since Daniel died, she meant it. The days that followed were a delicate dance of adjustment and accommodation. Ridge's cabin, built for solitude, suddenly had to accommodate 4 additional people. And not just any people, but 3 children who had spent months learning to be silent and invisible, and a mother who flinched at sudden movements and loud noises. Ridge adapted with surprising grace. He moved his few personal belongings to make room for Marin and the children. He built a second bed out of salvaged wood and rope, and a small trundle for Thomas that could slide underneath it during the day. He taught Clara how to tend the fire and Samuel how to care for the horse, giving them tasks that made them feel useful rather than burdensome. But it was with Thomas that Ridge truly shone. The little boy, still weak from his near-death experience in the storm, had attached himself to the cowboy with the desperate intensity of a child who had been starved of male attention. He followed Ridge everywhere, to the barn, to the woodshed, to the well, asking endless questions and chattering about everything and nothing. Any other man might have been annoyed, might have pushed the boy away. But Ridge listened with infinite patience, answering each question seriously, explaining each task as if Thomas were a full-grown apprentice rather than a 4-year-old. Why do horses eat hay, Mr. Ridge? Because hay has the things their bodies need to stay strong, like how you need vegetables to grow big and tall. I don't like vegetables. Neither do I, most of the time, but we eat them anyway. Why? Because sometimes doing what's good for us isn't the same as doing what we like. Ridge lifted Thomas onto his shoulders so the boy could see into the horse's stall. Life's like that a lot, I've found. Marin, watching from the cabin doorway, felt something shift in her chest. It was hard to reconcile this gentle, patient man with the cold-eyed stranger who had faced down Dawes Heller with a shotgun. Hard to believe they were the same person, and yet, somehow, they were. 2 sides of the same coin, hardness and softness, violence and tenderness. It made her wonder what else might be hiding beneath Ridge Callahan's weathered surface. A week passed, then 2. The snow began to melt slowly at first, then faster as February brought warmer winds from the south. News trickled in from town. Marcus Cole's testimony had reached the federal marshal, and an investigation was underway. Dawes Heller had not been arrested, but his operation was under scrutiny, and several of his workers had taken the opportunity to flee. "It's not over," Ridge cautioned when he brought this news back from one of his trips to town. "Heller's got money and connections. He'll fight this as long as he can." "But there's a chance," Marin said, "a real chance that he'll face justice." "There's a chance." Ridge paused, his expression unreadable. "There's also a chance he'll decide we're too dangerous to leave alone, that he'll come back with more men, more guns. We need to be ready for that." "How?" Ridge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed to the window and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the melting snow and the hints of brown earth beginning to show through. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about what I offered you. About staying here." Marin's heart quickened. They hadn't discussed it since that morning after Heller's attack, both of them seeming to understand that the topic was too important, too fragile to rush. And I think, Ridge turned to face her, "I think I was wrong to offer it the way I did, as if I were doing you a favor, as if you had no choice but to accept my charity. That's not how I took it. Maybe not, but it's how I meant it, at least partly." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration, or perhaps vulnerability. "I've been alone a long time, Mrs. Elwood. 12 years since Rebecca and Michael died. I got used to it, told myself I preferred it. But watching you with your children these past weeks..." He shook his head. "I don't want to go back to that. I don't want to watch you leave and return to an empty cabin and an empty life." "Ridge, let me finish, please." He took a breath. "What I should have said, what I'm trying to say now, is that I don't want you to stay because you have nowhere else to go. I don't want you to stay out of desperation or gratitude or because you think you owe me something." His eyes met hers, intense and honest. "I want you to stay because you want to. Because this, whatever this is between us, is something worth building on, something worth fighting for." Marin was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. She thought about Daniel, about the love they had shared, the life they had built together, the dreams they had dreamed. She thought about how his death had shattered her world, how she had spent the last 18 months just trying to survive, never allowing herself to imagine that she might someday feel whole again. And she thought about Ridge, about his gentleness with her children, his patience with her fears, his quiet strength that asked nothing in return, about the way her heart lifted when he walked through the door, the way she found herself watching for his return whenever he was away. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I've been hurt so many times. And I'm not just responsible for myself anymore. I have 3 children who depend on me. I can't afford to make another mistake." "I know." Ridge crossed the room and took her hands in his, gently, carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. "And I can't promise you that things will be easy. I can't promise that Dawes Heller won't come back, or that the winter won't be hard, or that we'll figure out how to make this work. But I can promise you one thing." "What?" "I will never hurt you, or your children." His voice was quiet but fierce. "I would die before I let that happen. And I know..." He paused, searching for words. "I know that words are cheap. I know that every man who's ever hurt you probably said something similar. But I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove it. Not today, not tomorrow, but over time, day by day, until you believe it." Marin looked up at him, at this strange, solitary man who had come out of a blizzard to save her life, who had faced down the monster from her past without flinching, who had opened his home and his heart to a woman he barely knew, and 3 children who weren't his own. She thought about what she wanted, not what she needed, not what was safe, not what made sense, but what she actually, truly wanted. And the answer surprised her. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll stay." Ridge's breath caught. "You mean it?" "I mean it." She squeezed his hands. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. Not because I'm desperate or grateful or obligated, but because..." She smiled, the first real smile she had allowed herself in months. "Because when I imagine the future, when I imagine somewhere my children could be happy and safe, this is what I see. This cabin, this land, you." For a moment, Ridge just stared at her, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. And then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, a real smile, warm and genuine, that transformed his weathered features into something almost beautiful. "Well then," he said, "I guess we've got some building to do." And outside, as if in response, the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the melting snow and the promise of spring to come. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest and happiest of Marin's life. There was so much to do. The cabin needed to be expanded to accommodate their growing family, which meant cutting timber and hauling logs and learning skills Marin had never imagined she would need. Ridge was a patient teacher, showing her how to use an axe, how to notch logs so they fit together, how to mix mortar that would keep out the wind and cold. The children helped too, in their own ways. Clara proved surprisingly adept at planning and organizing, creating lists of materials and keeping track of their progress. Samuel, quiet and serious, worked alongside Ridge with a determination that belied his young age, as if he were trying to prove something, to show that he was worthy of this new life they were building. And Thomas simply made everyone smile, with his endless questions and his wooden horse and his absolute certainty that Mr. Ridge could do anything. But it wasn't just the physical labor that occupied them. There were also conversations, long, meandering talks that ranged from the practical to the profound. Marin learned about Ridge's past, his childhood on this very land, his marriage to Rebecca, the joy of becoming a father, and the devastation of losing everything in a single terrible week. Ridge learned about Marin's past, her comfortable upbringing in the East, her adventurous decision to follow Daniel West, the slow erosion of hope as everything she'd built crumbled away. They talked about their fears, their dreams, their regrets. They disagreed about things, sometimes loudly, and then figured out how to compromise. They laughed together, cried together, sat in comfortable silence together as the fire crackled and the children slept. And slowly, imperceptibly, something changed between them. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of sudden revelation, no passionate declaration. It was more like the coming of spring itself, a gradual warming, a melting of ice, a tentative emergence of new growth. Marin found herself reaching for Ridge's hand without thinking about it. Ridge found himself looking forward to her presence in ways he hadn't experienced in over a decade. The children, with the uncanny perception of the young, sensed the shift and adjusted accordingly, calling him Ridge instead of Mr. Callahan, including him in their games and their arguments and their bedtime rituals. They were becoming a family. Not the family any of them had expected, but a family nonetheless, forged in crisis, tempered by hardship, held together by something stronger than blood. And then, on a mild March evening, everything changed again. Ridge had gone to town for supplies, his first overnight trip since the night Dawes Heller had broken into the cabin. Marin had insisted he go. They needed things that couldn't wait, and she was tired of living in constant fear. She had the rifle, the revolver, the locked doors. She would be fine. She had believed that, right up until the moment she heard hoofbeats approaching from the east. Not again, she thought, her blood turning to ice. Not again, not again, not again. But this time, instead of running to hide, she grabbed the rifle and stepped out onto the porch. She would not cower in the root cellar while her children trembled in the darkness. She would not wait for rescue that might not come. If Dawes Heller wanted her family, he would have to go through her first. The rider appeared through the trees, a single figure on horseback, moving fast. Marin raised the rifle to her shoulder, her heart pounding, her finger hovering over the trigger. The rider drew closer and closer, and then, "Mrs. Elwood, don't shoot! I come in peace!" It wasn't Dawes Heller. It was a young man, barely out of his teens, with a messenger's bag slung across his chest and a look of pure terror on his face. Marin lowered the rifle, but didn't put it down. "Who are you? What do you want?" "Name's Billy Hutchins, ma'am. I work for the federal marshal." The young man reined in his horse and dismounted, keeping his hands visible. "I've got a message for you. Urgent." "What message?" Billy reached slowly into his bag and pulled out an envelope. "Dawes Heller was arrested this morning. The marshal's office is requesting your testimony, yours and Mr. Callahan's, at the trial. It's happening in 2 weeks, in Fargo." Marin stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. "Arrested? He was actually arrested?" "Yes, ma'am. Charges include false imprisonment, fraud, assault, and Billy hesitated. And murder. 3 counts. Workers from his operation who disappeared over the years. They found the bodies last week. Murder. Maren felt dizzy. She had known Dawes Heller was capable of cruelty, had known he was dangerous, but murder? The murder of people who had been in her same position, desperate and trapped and trying to survive. Mrs. Elwood, are you all right? Yes. Maren shook herself. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you for bringing this news. There's more, ma'am. Billy's expression was grim. The marshal says you should be careful. Heller's got friends. People who might try to intimidate witnesses before the trial. He's sending men to watch the roads, but he shrugged helplessly. There's a lot of territory out here. I understand. Maren took the envelope. Thank you, Mr. Hutchins. Will you stay for dinner? You've come a long way. I appreciate the offer, ma'am, but I've got to get back. Just watch yourselves, all right? This isn't over yet. He remounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Maren stood on the porch for a long time after he left, the envelope clutched in her hands, her mind racing. Dawes Heller had been arrested. The monster who had tormented her family, who had threatened her children, who had killed 3 innocent people. He was finally facing justice. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt like relief. Instead, all she felt was fear. Because Billy was right. This wasn't over. And until Dawes Heller was convicted and locked away forever, none of them were truly safe. Ridge returned the next morning to find Maren waiting for him on the porch, the rifle in her hands and dark circles under her eyes. What happened? He demanded, swinging down from his horse before it had fully stopped. What's wrong? She told him everything. Billy's visit, the arrest, the trial, the warning about Heller's friends. Ridge listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word. 2 weeks, he said when she finished. Trial's in 2 weeks. Yes. And the marshal thinks someone might try to stop us from testifying. That's what he said. Ridge was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon. Then he turned to her, his eyes hard with determination. Then we'll be ready for them. How? I know some people, old friends from before, men who owe me favors. Ridge's jaw tightened. If Heller's friends come here, they'll find more than a woman with a rifle waiting for them. Ridgey... Maren stepped closer, searching his face. Are you sure about this? These men, if they're the kind of people Heller associates with, they won't hurt you. Ridge took her hands, his grip firm and steady. They won't hurt the children. I swear it on my life. Maren looked at him, at this man who had already risked so much for her, who had already proven himself 100 times over, and she realized that she believed him, completely, without reservation. Okay, she said. Then let's get ready. The 2 weeks before the trial were a time of preparation and vigilance. True to his word, Ridge contacted his old associates, former soldiers mostly, men who had served with him during the territorial conflicts and who had settled in the area afterward. They arrived over the following days, one by one, setting up a perimeter around the cabin and establishing watch rotations. Maren was initially wary of these rough-looking strangers, but she quickly came to appreciate their presence. They were respectful, professional, and utterly devoted to Ridge. When she asked him about it, he just shrugged. We went through hard times together. That creates bonds that don't break. The children, predictably, were fascinated by the newcomers. Samuel peppered them with questions about their weapons and their horses, while Thomas insisted on showing everyone his wooden horse. Even Clara, usually so reserved, warmed to them, especially after one of the men, a grizzled veteran named Pete, taught her how to play a dice game that had her laughing for the first time in weeks. But despite the additional protection, the tension never fully lifted. Every unexpected sound made Maren jump. Every unfamiliar rider on the distant road made Ridge reach for his gun. They were waiting for something, some attempt by Heller's allies to silence them, and the waiting was almost worse than the threat itself. And then, 3 days before they were scheduled to leave for Fargo, it happened. Maren was inside with the children when she heard the gunshots, not close, somewhere beyond the tree line where Pete and another man were standing watch, but unmistakable. Stay here, she told Clara, pressing the revolver into her daughter's trembling hands. "Lock the door! Don't open it for anyone!" And then she grabbed the rifle and ran outside. The scene that met her eyes was chaos. Ridge and two of his men were crouched behind a makeshift barricade of logs and barrels, exchanging fire with what looked like half a dozen attackers on horseback. Smoke filled the air. Horses screamed. Somewhere, someone was shouting orders. "Get back inside," Ridge yelled when he saw her. "Marin, get back!" A bullet whizzed past her head, close enough that she felt the wind of its passage. Marin dropped to the ground, her heart racing, the rifle clutched uselessly in her hands. She couldn't see where the shot had come from, couldn't see anything through the smoke and confusion. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the gunfire stopped. Marin lifted her head. The attackers were retreating, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they fled toward the horizon. Ridge and his men were rising from behind their barricade, weapons still raised, watching to make sure the enemy was truly gone. "Anyone hurt?" Ridge called out. "Pete took one in the arm, nothing serious." "Get him inside. Clean the wound." Ridge turned and strode toward Marin, his face pale with fear and fury. "Are you all right? Did they hit you?" "I'm fine." Marin let him help her to her feet, her legs shaking. "The children are safe." Clara locked the door, just like you told her. Ridge pulled her into a fierce embrace, his arms crushing her against his chest. "Don't ever do that again. Don't ever run toward gunfire." "I thought you needed help." "I need you alive." His voice was rough, broken. "I need you to stay alive. Promise me." Marin buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the smell of gunpowder and sweat and him. "I promise." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other, as the smoke cleared and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. It was over. For now. But they both knew the real battle was still to come. The morning they left for Fargo dawned cold and gray, with clouds hanging low over the plains like a funeral shroud. Marin stood on the cabin porch, watching Ridge and his men load the wagon, and tried to ignore the knot of dread that had taken up permanent residence in her stomach. 3 days. 3 days until the trial. 3 days until she would have to stand in a courtroom and face the man who had tormented her family, who had tried to destroy them, who had killed 3 innocent people and buried their bodies in unmarked graves. 3 days until everything was decided, one way or another. "Mama?" Clara appeared at her elbow, her face pale but determined. "Are you scared?" Marin considered lying, considered giving her daughter the comforting reassurance that mothers were supposed to provide. But Clara was 11 years old now, old enough to recognize a lie when she heard one. And after everything they had been through together, she deserved the truth. "Yes," Marin admitted. Marin nodded. "I'm scared." "Me too." Clara slipped her hand into her mother's. "But Mr. Ridge says that being scared doesn't mean you're weak. It means you understand what's at stake." "Mr. Ridge is a wise man." "I know." Clara paused, watching the men work. "Mama, do you love him?" The question caught Marin off guard. She looked down at her daughter, at those 2 old eyes in that young face, and felt her heart squeeze. "I think I do," she said softly. Is that okay with you?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Papa's been gone a long time, and he would have wanted you to be happy." She squeezed Marin's hand. "Mr. Ridge makes you happy. I can see it. So yes, it's okay with me." Marin pulled her daughter into a hug, blinking back tears. "When did you get so grown up?" "I don't know. It just happened." Clara's voice was muffled against her shoulder. "I think maybe bad things make you grow up faster than you should." "Maybe they do." Marin held her tighter. "But you're still my little girl, no matter how grown up you get." They stood there for a long moment, mother and daughter, drawing strength from each other. And then Ridge's voice cut through the morning air. "Wagon's ready. We need to move if we're going to make the first way station before dark." The journey to Fargo would take 2 days under normal circumstances, longer if the weather turned or if they encountered trouble on the road. Ridge had planned the route carefully, choosing paths that offered cover and avoiding the main thoroughfares where Heller's allies might be watching. His men would ride with them for the first day. then peel off to guard their back trail while Ridge, Marin, and the children continued on with 2 escorts. It wasn't a foolproof plan. Nothing was. Not when you were dealing with men who had already proven they were willing to kill. But it was the best they could do, and Marin had learned to accept that sometimes the best you could do was all you had. "Everyone in the wagon," Ridge called. "Let's go!" The children climbed in first, Samuel helping Thomas up, Clara settling their small bundle of belongings. Marin paused at the back of the wagon, looking at the cabin one last time. It was strange, she thought, how much could change in such a short time. 2 months ago, she had never seen this place. 2 months ago, she had been freezing to death in a tent, certain that she and her children would not survive the night. And now this rough little cabin in the middle of nowhere felt more like home than anywhere she had ever lived. "We'll be back," Ridge said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "This isn't goodbye." "I know." Marin turned to face him. I want to remember it. In case what?" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't put into words the fear that had been gnawing at her ever since the attack 3 days ago. The fear that something would go wrong at the trial, that Heller would escape justice somehow, that they would never be able to return to this fragile new life they had built together. Ridge seemed to understand anyway. He reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Listen to me," he said. "Whatever happens in Fargo, whatever the trial brings, we'll face it together. And when it's over, we'll come back here and build that second room I promised you. We'll watch your children grow up safe and strong. We'll have a life, Marin. A real life." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "I won't let anyone take that away from us. I swear it." Marin looked at him, at this man who had become so much more than a stranger, so much more than a rescuer. At this man who had given her hope when she had none, who had shown her that trust was still possible, that love was still possible. "I believe you," she said, and she did. The first day of travel passed without incident. Ridge's men surrounded the wagon like a protective shell, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats that never materialized. The children, restless at first, eventually settled into the rhythm of the journey, Samuel watching the passing landscape with quiet intensity, Thomas napping in Clara's lap, Clara reading aloud from a battered book of poetry that Pete had given her before they left. Marin sat beside Ridge on the driver's bench, close enough that their shoulders touched with every bump and jolt of the wagon. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said, but the silence between them was comfortable, companionable. The silence of 2 people who understood each other without needing words. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, they reached the way station, a rough wooden building that served as both inn and trading post for travelers on this remote stretch of road. Ridge's men would camp outside, keeping watch through the night, while Ridge, Marin, and the children took rooms inside. "One night," Ridge said as they unloaded the wagon, "tomorrow we push through to Fargo. The marshal's men will meet us on the outskirts of town and escort us the rest of the way. And then we wait for the trial." Ridge lifted Thomas down from the wagon, the boy immediately wrapping his arms around the cowboy's neck. "The prosecutor wants to meet with you tomorrow night. Go over your testimony. Make sure you're ready." "I'm ready." Marin's voice was firmer than she felt. "I've been ready for months." Ridge nodded, but there was concern in his eyes. "It won't be easy. Heller's lawyer is going to try to make you look bad, unreliable, vindictive, maybe even crazy. That's what they do in these cases. They attack the witnesses because they can't defend the crime." "I know." "And you'll have to see him, Heller. He'll be right there in the courtroom, watching you, trying to intimidate you." Ridge set Thomas down and turned to face her fully. "Can you handle that?" Marin thought about all the times Dawes Heller had tried to intimidate her, all the threats, the violence, the systematic cruelty designed to break her spirit. She thought about standing in that courtroom, facing him one last time, and telling the world exactly what he had done. "Yes," she said. "I can handle it." Ridge studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of doubt or weakness. Then, slowly, he smiled. "I believe you." The way station was simple but clean, wooden bunks, a communal fireplace, and a proprietor who asked no questions and expected none in return. Marin settled the children in their room, made sure they had eaten, and then stepped outside to find Ridge standing on the porch, staring out at the darkening plains. "You should sleep," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Tomorrow will be long." "So should you." "I will. I just—" She wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. "I keep thinking about what happens after the trial, I mean. If Heller is convicted." "When he's convicted," Ridge corrected. "When he's convicted." Marin smiled slightly at his certainty. "What then? What does our life look like?" Ridge was quiet for a moment, considering the question. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost wistful. "I've been thinking about that too. Thinking about all the things I gave up after Rebecca and Michael died. All the dreams I buried along with them." He turned to look at her. "I used to want things, Marin. A family, a future. Children running around the cabin, making noise and getting into trouble. I wanted to build something that would last. Something that would matter after I was gone. And then you lost them. And then I lost them. And I told myself that wanting things was dangerous, that caring about people only led to pain. So I stopped wanting, stopped caring, stopped living, really, except in the most basic sense." Ridge paused, his eyes distant. "And then you stumbled into my life in the middle of a blizzard, half frozen and half dead, with 3 children who needed protecting. And suddenly what? Suddenly, I was alive again." Ridge reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I don't know what comes after the trial. I don't know if Heller will be convicted or what his friends might do or how long it will take before we can truly feel safe. But I know one thing." "What?" "I know that whatever comes, I want to face it with you." He met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw everything he struggled to put into words: love, fear, hope, determination. "I want to build that life I dreamed about, the one I thought I'd lost forever. And I want to build it with you and your children. If that's what you want too." Marin felt tears pricking at her eyes. She blinked them back, not wanting to cry. But they came anyway. Tears of grief for everything she had lost. Tears of gratitude for everything she had found. "Yes," she whispered. "That's what I want." Ridge pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, and she closed her eyes and let herself believe, for just this moment, that everything would be all right. "We should get some rest," Ridge murmured against her hair. "Long day tomorrow." "I know." Marin didn't move. "Just a little longer." He held her a little longer. They reached the outskirts of Fargo late the following afternoon. The town was larger than Marin had expected, a bustling center of commerce and government, with brick buildings and wooden sidewalks, and more people than she had seen in months. After the isolation of Ridge's cabin, the noise and activity felt almost overwhelming. True to Ridge's word, a group of men waited for them on the main road into town, 4 federal marshals in dark coats, their badges gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Mr. Callahan?" The lead marshal, a stern-faced man with graying hair, rode up alongside the wagon. "I'm Deputy Marshal Hayes. We've been expecting you." "Any trouble on the roads?" "Nothing we couldn't handle. A couple of Heller's boys tried to set up an ambush about 5 miles back. We convinced them to reconsider." Marin felt a chill run down her spine. "They're still trying to stop us?" "They're getting desperate," Hayes said. "Trial starts day after tomorrow, and they know their boss is in trouble. The evidence against him is overwhelming. Testimony from Marcus Cole, documents we found at his operation, and those 3 bodies." He shook his head grimly. "Dawes Heller is going to hang Mrs. Elwood. The only question is whether we can keep you safe long enough to make sure of it." The marshals escorted them through town to a modest hotel near the courthouse. It wasn't fancy, but it was secure. Guards posted at every entrance, marshals patrolling the hallways, a direct line of sight to the sheriff's office across the street. "You'll stay here until the trial," Hayes explained as they settled into their rooms. "We've got men watching the building around the clock. Anyone tries anything, they'll have to go through us first." "And my children?" Marin asked. "Safe as houses. We've got a family in town, good people, trustworthy, who've agreed to look after them during the trial. They'll be close by, but out of harm's way. The thought of being separated from her children, even temporarily, made Marin's heart clench. But she understood the logic. The courtroom would be no place for them, not with Dawes Heller sitting there, not with his allies watching from the gallery. Can I see them? Before the trial starts? Of course. Every evening, if you like. We'll bring them to you. Hayes's expression softened slightly. I know this is hard, Mrs. Elwood, but we're going to get justice for what that man did to you. I promise you that. Justice. It was a word Marin had stopped believing in during those long, terrible months at Heller's operation. Justice was supposed to protect the innocent, punish the guilty, maintain order in a chaotic world. But in her experience, justice was just another word for whatever the powerful decided it should mean. And yet, here she was, in a hotel room in Fargo, surrounded by federal marshals, preparing to testify against the man who had nearly destroyed her. Maybe justice was real after all. Maybe it just took longer to arrive than people expected. Thank you, Marshal Hayes, she said, for everything you're doing. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when Heller's swinging from a rope. The evening before the trial, Marin met with the prosecutor in a private room at the hotel. His name was Edward Carmichael, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s with a reputation for winning difficult cases. He had traveled from the territorial capital specifically for this trial, and his presence was a sign of how seriously the government was taking the charges against Dawes Heller. Mrs. Elwood. Carmichael rose to greet her as she entered, his handshake firm but not aggressive. Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy. It's necessary, Marin said. That's what matters. Indeed. Carmichael gestured for her to sit. Let me explain what's going to happen tomorrow. The prosecution will present evidence first, documents, physical evidence, testimony from other witnesses, including Marcus Cole. Your testimony will come on the second day, after we've established the pattern of abuse and fraud at Heller's operation. And his lawyer, what should I expect from him? Carmichael's expression darkened. Heller's hired Victor Blackwood. He's not a pleasant man. He'll try to discredit you, paint you as a liar, a thief, maybe even suggest that you're the one who owes Heller money rather than the other way around. He'll attack your character, your judgment, your memory. His goal is to make the jury doubt everything you say. Marin felt her stomach tighten. And how do I fight that? By telling the truth, simply, clearly, consistently. Carmichael leaned forward. The facts are on our side, Mrs. Elwood. What Heller did is monstrous, and we have evidence to prove it. All you have to do is tell your story. Let the jury see the human cost of his crimes. That sounds easier than it will be. It is. But you've already done the hard part. You survived. You got your children out. You're here, ready to face him. Carmichael's voice softened. That takes courage. Don't let Blackwood make you forget that. They spent the next 2 hours going over Marin's testimony, the questions Carmichael would ask, the answers she would give, the traps Blackwood might set, and how to avoid them. By the time they finished, Marin's head was spinning with legal terminology and strategic considerations, but she also felt something she hadn't expected. She felt ready. One more thing, Carmichael said as she rose to leave. Tomorrow, when you're on that stand, don't look at Heller. Don't give him the satisfaction of seeing your fear. Look at me, or at the jury, or at that cowboy of yours in the gallery. Anyone but him. My cowboy? Carmichael smiled slightly. Ridge Callahan, the man who pulled you out of that blizzard and has been protecting you ever since. I've heard the stories. He paused. He's a good man, Mrs. Elwood. When this is over, you should hold on to him. Marin felt a warmth spread through her chest. I intend to. That night, Ridge came to her room, not for anything improper, there were marshals in the hallway and proprieties to maintain, but simply to sit with her, to talk, to remind her that she wasn't alone. The children are settled, he reported, taking the chair across from where she sat on the edge of the bed. Clara's reading to the boys. They miss you, but they understand why they can't be here. Do they? As much as children can understand anything like this. Ridge ran a hand through his hair. Thomas asked me if the bad man was going to hurt you. I told him no. I told him you were the bravest person I'd ever met, and that the bad man should be afraid of you, not the other way around. Marin smiled despite herself. That's not exactly true. It's exactly true. Ridge leaned forward, his eyes intense. Marin, do you understand what you've done? You walked into a blizzard with 3 children rather than stay with a monster. You testified to a federal prosecutor despite knowing Heller's men were trying to silence you. Tomorrow, you're going to stand up in a courtroom and tell the world what happened, knowing that man will be sitting right there watching you. He shook his head. That's not cowardice. That's courage, the real kind. I don't feel courageous. I feel terrified. That's what courage is. Doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified. Ridge reached out and took her hand. You're going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow and tell the truth. And when you do, you're going to set yourself free. Not just from Heller, but from everything he represents. The fear, the shame, the feeling that you deserved what happened to you. I know I didn't deserve it. Do you? Really? Ridge's grip tightened. Because I've watched you these past weeks. I've seen the way you flinch when someone raises their voice. The way you apologize for things that aren't your fault. The way you expect the worst from people, always. Because that's what you've learned to expect. He paused. Heller didn't just hurt your body, Marin. He hurt your soul. And tomorrow, when you stand up and tell the world what he did, you start taking that back. Marin felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She didn't try to stop them. What if I'm not strong enough? You are. I know you are. Ridge stood and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her. And even if you forget, even if you stumble or falter or lose your words, I'll be right there in that gallery, watching you, believing in you, reminding you who you really are. Marin buried her face in his chest, letting his warmth and steadiness seep into her bones. Stay, she whispered. Not for... just stay. I don't want to be alone tonight. Ridge was quiet for a moment. Then he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I'll stay as long as you need. They sat together through the long hours of the night, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, drawing strength from each other's presence. And when morning finally came, bringing with it the gray light of dawn and the weight of everything that lay ahead, Marin felt something she hadn't expected. She felt ready. The courtroom was smaller than Marin had imagined. A cramped wooden building with rows of hard benches and tall windows that let in the pale March light. By the time she arrived, escorted by Marshal Hayes and flanked by Ridge, the gallery was already full. Townspeople, journalists, curious onlookers, they had all come to see the trial of Dawes Heller, the man accused of running a debt slavery operation in the Dakota Territory. And there, at the defendant's table, sat the monster himself. Dawes Heller looked different in chains. Smaller, somehow, less imposing. His expensive clothes had been replaced by a plain prison uniform, and his carefully maintained appearance had given way to stubble and dark circles under his eyes. But his gaze, that cold, predatory gaze that had haunted Marin's nightmares, was exactly the same. He looked at her as she entered, smiled. Marin looked away. The first day of the trial passed in a blur of legal proceedings. Carmichael presented his opening statement, outlining the charges against Heller and promising evidence that would prove each one beyond reasonable doubt. Blackwood countered with his own opening, painting Heller as a successful businessman who was being persecuted by disgruntled former employees with axes to grind. Witnesses testified. Documents were entered into evidence. The 3 bodies found on Heller's property were described in clinical detail by a medical examiner who had traveled from the territorial capital to testify. Through it all, Marin sat in the gallery, Ridge's hand clasped tightly in hers, waiting for her turn. It came on the second day. The prosecution calls Marin Elwood to the stand. The walk from her seat to the witness box felt like the longest journey of Marin's life. She was aware of every eye in the courtroom following her, the jurors, the spectators, the journalists scribbling in their notebooks. And she was aware, most of all, of Dawes Heller's gaze burning into her back like a brand. She reached the witness stand, placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth. And then she began. Mrs. Elwood, Carmichael said, his voice calm and measured, please tell the court how you came to be employed at Mr. Heller's operation. Marin took a breath. After my husband died, I lost everything. The bank took our farm, our animals, all our possessions. I had 3 children and no way to provide for them. I heard that Mr. Heller was hiring workers, room, board, and wages, so I went to him for help. And what happened when you arrived? At first, it seemed legitimate. Mr. Heller showed me the workers' quarters, explained the terms of employment, promised that my children would be cared for while I worked. Marin paused, steadying herself. But once we were there, everything changed. How so? The work was endless, 16 hours a day, sometimes more. My children were put to work too, even though they were young. Clara was in the fields from sunup to sundown. Samuel helped with the cattle, even though he was only 7. Marin's voice wavered. And the wages Mr. Heller promised never came. Every month, there was some new expense that ate up what we were owed. After 6 months, I realized we weren't earning anything. We were sinking deeper and deeper into debt. Did you try to leave? Yes, I tried twice. Marin felt her hands trembling and pressed them flat against her thighs. The first time, Mr. Heller's men caught us before we'd gone a mile. They brought us back, and Mr. Heller made it clear what would happen if we tried again. What did he threaten? Marin looked at Carmichael, not at Heller, focused on the prosecutor's steady gaze, drew strength from it. He said he would have me arrested for theft, for stealing the food and supplies I'd supposedly consumed while working there. He said he would take my children and put them in a workhouse, and he said, she swallowed hard. He said if I gave him what he wanted, he might reconsider. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Carmichael waited for it to subside before continuing. What did Mr. Heller want? Me, personally. Marin's voice was barely above a whisper. He made it clear that he expected certain favors in exchange for better treatment. And did you comply? No, I refused. Marin lifted her chin, and after that things got worse. Less food, more work, longer hours. He was punishing me for saying no. Carmichael nodded slowly. Mrs. Elwood, how did you eventually escape from Mr. Heller's operation? I ran. In the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, I took my children and ran. I stole a tent and some blankets, that much is true, and I walked out into the snow with nothing else. Marin paused. We nearly died. We would have died if a man named Ridge Callahan hadn't found us and taken us to his cabin. And what happened after that? Mr. Heller came for us. He broke into Mr. Callahan's cabin with 2 of his men and tried to take us back by force. He said we were his property, that we owed him money, that he had every legal right to bring us back. Marin's eyes finally, briefly, flickered toward Heller. But he was wrong. We were never his property, and we never owed him anything except our freedom. The courtroom was silent. Even Heller had stopped smiling. Carmichael let the moment stretch before speaking again. Thank you, Mrs. Elwood. No further questions. Now came the hard part. Victor Blackwood rose from the defense table, a tall, thin man with sharp features and a perpetual sneer. He approached the witness stand like a predator circling its prey. Mrs. Elwood, he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, you've painted quite a picture of my client. A monster, a predator, a man who held you against your will and threatened your children. Very compelling. It's the truth. Is it? Blackwood raised an eyebrow. Let's explore that, shall we? You mentioned that you arrived at Mr. Heller's operation after losing your farm. Tell me, Mrs. Elwood, why did you lose that farm? Marin felt a chill run down her spine. My husband took out loans I didn't know about. After he died, the bank called them in. Loans your husband took out. Blackwood nodded slowly. And you had no idea about these loans? No involvement in the financial decisions of your household? My husband handled the finances. I see. So you're asking this court to believe that you were completely ignorant of debts totaling several $100s? That your husband, your partner, your spouse, deceived you entirely about the state of your family's finances? Objection, Carmichael said. Relevance. I'm establishing the witness's credibility, Your Honor, Blackwood replied smoothly. If Mrs. Elwood was deceived by her own husband about financial matters, perhaps she was also deceived about the nature of her arrangement with my client. I'll allow it, the judge said. But get to the point, Mr. Blackwood. Blackwood smiled. a thin, cold expression that made Marin's skin crawl. "Mrs. Elwood, isn't it true that you signed a contract with Mr. Heller when you arrived at his operation? A contract that clearly spelled out the terms of your employment, including the costs of room, board, and other expenses?" "I signed something, yes, but I was desperate and Mr. Heller didn't explain what I was signing. He just said it was standard paperwork." "Standard paperwork that you didn't bother to read?" "I couldn't read it. It was written in legal language I didn't understand." "But you signed it anyway." Blackwood's tone sharpened. "You signed a legally binding contract, accepted room and board, and clothing and food for yourself and your 3 children, and now you're claiming that you owed nothing in return." "What we owed, we paid back many times over. The hours we worked, the hours you claim you worked," Blackwood interrupted. "Do you have any documentation of these hours, Mrs. Elwood? Any records, any proof beyond your own word?" "Mr. Heller kept the records. He controlled everything." "How convenient." Blackwood turned to the jury, spreading his hands. "So we're expected to believe that my client is a monster based solely on the testimony of a woman who admittedly signed a contract she didn't read, who may or may not have worked the hours she claims, and who by her own admission is capable of being deceived about significant financial matters." He turned back to Marin. "Tell me, Mrs. Elwood, when you stole that tent and those blankets and fled Mr. Heller's operation, did you also steal food?" "We took what we needed to survive." "So yes, you did steal food." Blackwood's voice hardened. "You stole property that belonged to my client, fled in the middle of the night like a common criminal, and now you're sitting on that witness stand claiming to be the victim." He leaned in close. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Elwood, that this entire trial is simply your attempt to avoid paying a legitimate debt? That you've made up these accusations to escape consequences for your own actions?" "No." Marin's voice was shaking, but she forced herself to meet Blackwood's eyes. "That is not true." "Isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, you look like a woman who found herself in over her head, made some poor decisions, and is now trying to blame everyone but herself for the results." Blackwood straightened, adjusting his coat. "No further questions." Marin sat frozen in the witness chair, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had known Blackwood would attack her. Carmichael had warned her. But the reality was worse than she had imagined. Every word out of his mouth had been designed to make her look like a liar, a thief, a woman who couldn't be trusted. And the worst part was, some of it was true. She had signed that contract without reading it. She had stolen food and supplies when she fled. She was making accusations based largely on her own testimony, without much documentation to back them up. What if the jury believed Blackwood? What if they looked at her and saw exactly what he wanted them to see, a desperate woman trying to escape her debts? What if Heller went free? "Mrs. Elwood," the judge's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "You may step down." Marin rose on legs that felt like water and made her way back to the gallery. Ridge was there, waiting for her, his face tight with barely contained fury. "That bastard," he muttered as she sank into the seat beside him. Every word out of his mouth was poison. "But some of it was true." Marin's voice was barely a whisper. "I did sign that contract. I did steal things when I left." "Marin," Ridge took her hand, gripping it tightly. "Listen to me. You did what you had to do to save your children. That's not a crime. That's survival. And the jury knows the difference." "Do they?" Ridge didn't answer. He just held her hand and watched as the trial continued. The prosecution called more witnesses. Other former workers from Heller's operation. Men and women who had similar stories of debt slavery and abuse. Marcus Cole testified about his wife's death and his children's fate, breaking down in tears on the stand. A federal inspector described the conditions he had found at the operation, the cramped quarters, the meager rations, the documents that had been falsified to make debts appear larger than they were. And then finally, it was time for closing arguments. Carmichael went first. He stood before the jury, his voice calm but passionate, and laid out the case against Dawes Heller in damning detail. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the past 2 days you have heard testimony from multiple witnesses, men, women, and children who were held against their will by Dawes Heller and forced to work under conditions that can only be described as slavery. You have seen documents proving that Mr. Heller systematically falsified records to inflate debts and trap workers in bondage. And you have heard about 3 bodies, 3 human beings, whose lives ended because they tried to escape. He paused, letting his words sink in. The defense would have you believe that these witnesses are liars and thieves, that they signed contracts willingly and are now trying to escape legitimate debts. But ask yourselves this: if Mr. Heller's operation was legal and above board, why did workers keep trying to flee? Why did 3 of them end up dead? And why, when Mrs. Elwood finally escaped, did Mr. Heller send armed men to drag her back? Carmichael walked slowly along the jury box, meeting each juror's eyes in turn. Dawes Heller is not a businessman. He is not an employer. He is a predator who preyed on the desperate and the vulnerable, who used debt as a weapon and violence as enforcement. And today, you have the power to stop him. To say that no matter how much money he has, no matter how many connections, no matter how good his lawyer, what he did was wrong. What he did was criminal. What he did was murder. He returned to his table, his final words hanging in the air. Find Dawes Heller guilty. Give his victims the justice they deserve. Blackwood's closing argument was equally polished, equally passionate, but it rang hollow against the weight of evidence that had been presented. He attacked the witnesses' credibility, questioned the documents, suggested that the 3 deaths were accidents rather than murders. But even as he spoke, Marin could see the jurors' faces growing harder, their eyes flickering toward Heller with something that looked like disgust. When Blackwood finished, the judge called a recess. The jury would deliberate overnight and deliver their verdict in the morning. That night, Marin couldn't sleep. She lay in her hotel room, staring at the ceiling, running through every moment of the trial in her mind. Had she said enough? Had she been convincing? Had the jury seen through Blackwood's attacks, or had they bought his version of events? A knock on the door made her heart jump. "Marin? It's me." She rose and let Ridge in. He looked as exhausted as she felt. Dark circles under his eyes, tension in every line of his body. "Any news?" she asked. "No, jury's still deliberating." He sat down heavily in the chair by the window. "But the marshals seem optimistic. They think we've got a good chance." "A good chance isn't a certainty." "No, it's not." Ridge looked at her, his eyes soft with concern. "How are you holding up?" Marin laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "I don't know. I feel like I've been holding my breath for months, and I won't be able to exhale until this is over." She sank onto the bed, her shoulders slumping. "What if he goes free, Ridge? What if the jury doesn't believe us?" "Then we'll find another way." Ridge crossed to sit beside her. "The federal marshal is already looking into Heller's connections in local government. Even if this trial doesn't go our way, there will be other opportunities." "But we might not survive long enough to take them. Heller's men won't touch you." "I won't let them." Ridge's voice was fierce. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Marin, I will keep you and your children safe. That's a promise." Marin leaned into him, letting her head rest on his shoulder. "I know you will. I'm just tired. Tired of being afraid, tired of fighting." "I know." Ridge wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "But it's almost over. One way or another, it's almost over." They sat there together, drawing comfort from each other's presence, until exhaustion finally claimed them both. The verdict came at noon the next day. The courtroom was packed, even more crowded than it had been during the trial itself. Word had spread through town that the jury was ready, and it seemed like half of Fargo had turned out to hear the result. Marin sat between Ridge and Marshal Hayes, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Across the room, Dawes Heller sat at the defense table with Blackwood, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on the jury box. The foreman rose, a heavy-set man with a beard and a serious expression. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the judge said, "have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "Please announce it." The foreman unfolded a piece of paper and read from it in a steady voice. "In the matter of the Territory versus Dawes Heller, on the charge of false imprisonment, we find the defendant guilty." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Marin felt Ridge's hand grip hers. "On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty." The murmur grew louder. "On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty." Heller's face had gone pale. Blackwood was leaning in, whispering urgently, but his client wasn't listening. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. People were shouting, crying, embracing each other. Journalists were scribbling furiously in their notebooks. The judge was banging his gavel, calling for order, but nobody was listening. And Marin was crying, guilty. Dawes Heller had been found guilty on all counts. He was going to prison. He was going to hang. It was over. After all the fear, all the pain, all the desperate struggles to survive, it was finally over. Ridge pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as she sobbed against his shoulder. "You did it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Marin, you did it." "We did it," she managed. "Together." Across the room, marshals were moving toward Heller, preparing to take him back to his cell. As they approached, Heller looked up, looked directly at Marin, and for one terrible moment his expression twisted into something ugly and hateful. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You hear me? This isn't over." But it was. The marshals pulled him to his feet, slapped the chains on his wrists, and led him away. And Marin watched him go, feeling something shift inside her, something heavy and dark that she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Fear. She had been afraid for so long, afraid of Heller, afraid of poverty, afraid of failure, afraid of everything. And now, watching her tormentor being dragged away in chains, she felt that fear begin to loosen its grip. She wasn't free yet, not completely. The healing would take time, and there would be setbacks and struggles and dark nights when the old terrors returned. But she had taken the first step. She had faced the monster, told her story, and watched him be held accountable for his crimes. And that was something no one could ever take away from her. The sentencing hearing was held a week later. The judge, a stern man who had shown no sympathy for Heller throughout the trial, pronounced the sentence with cold finality. "Dawes Heller, you have been found guilty of crimes that shock the conscience of this court. You preyed upon the desperate and vulnerable, using debt as a weapon to hold them in bondage. You worked men, women, and children to the point of collapse. And when some of them tried to escape, you murdered them." The judge paused, his eyes boring into Heller's. "There is no punishment sufficient for what you have done, but the law provides what it provides, and I am bound by it." He drew himself up. "Dawes Heller, I sentence you to death by hanging. The execution will be carried out 30 days hence, at the territorial prison in Bismarck. May God have mercy on your soul." Heller didn't react, didn't speak, didn't protest, didn't do anything except stare straight ahead with empty eyes. Whatever fight had been in him, the verdict had broken it. Marin watched from the gallery, Ridge's hand in hers, and felt nothing but a quiet, profound relief. It was done. Justice had been served. Now she could begin to live again. The journey back to the cabin felt different than the journey out. The weather was warmer, the roads clearer, the weight on Marin's shoulders lighter than it had been in years. The children, reunited with their mother after almost a week apart, chattered endlessly about their adventures with the family in Fargo. The games they'd played, the food they'd eaten, the friends they'd made. "Can we go back and visit them someday?" Samuel asked. "Maybe," Marin said. "We'll see." Ridge drove the wagon in companionable silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife to the children, but otherwise content to let them talk. He looked different too, Marin noticed. Younger, somehow. Less burdened. As if the trial's outcome had lifted something from him as well. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him quietly, during a stretch when the children were distracted by a hawk circling overhead. Ridge was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I'm thinking about the future." "What about it?" "How different it looks now." He glanced at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "A few months ago, I was alone in that cabin, expecting to stay alone for the rest of my life. And now? Now I've got a woman I love and 3 children who call me Ridge, and a life that actually means something." He shook his head slowly. "It's more than I ever thought I'd have again." Marin felt warmth spreading through her chest. "A woman you love?" Ridge met her eyes. "You know I do. I haven't said it properly. Haven't found the right moment. But yes, I love you, Marin. I have for a while now." Tears pricked at Marin's eyes, happy tears this time. I love you too. Ridge smiled, a real smile, wide and warm and full of hope. Well then, I guess we should talk about making things official. Official? I'm asking you to marry me, Marin. His voice was soft but steady. Not because you need me to protect you, or because you have nowhere else to go, but because I want to spend the rest of my life with you and your children, because you've brought something back into my world that I thought was gone forever. He paused. Will you? Marin looked at him, at this man who had come out of a blizzard to save her life, who had stood beside her through danger and fear, who had taught her that trust was still possible and love was still real. Yes, she said. Yes, I will. From the back of the wagon, Thomas's voice piped up. Does this mean Mr. Ridge is going to be our papa now? Marin and Ridge exchanged a look, then burst out laughing. I suppose it does, Ridge said. If that's all right with you. Thomas appeared between them, his face bright with excitement. Can I call you Papa Ridge? Ridge's expression softened. You can call me whatever you want, son. Thomas threw his arms around Ridge's neck, nearly knocking the cowboy off the driver's bench. Samuel and Clara were there too, suddenly, piling into the embrace, and for a moment the wagon wobbled dangerously on the rutted road. Careful! Marin laughed. You'll tip us over. But nobody seemed to care. They were too busy being a family. The cabin came into view late in the afternoon, smoke rising from the chimney where Pete and one of the other men had been keeping the fire going in their absence. The snow was almost gone now, revealing patches of brown earth and the first tentative hints of green, grass pushing up through the mud, buds beginning to form on the bare branches of the trees. Spring was coming, a new season, a new beginning, a new chance at the life they had all been denied for so long. Home, Clara said softly, looking at the cabin with something like wonder. Home, Marin agreed. They pulled up to the porch, and Ridge jumped down to help the children out of the wagon. One by one they climbed down, Samuel first, then Clara, then Thomas, who insisted on being carried on Ridge's shoulders. Let me down, Papa Ridge. I want to go inside. Ridge swung him to the ground, and Thomas raced for the door, his siblings right behind him. Marin stayed back, watching them go, a smile on her face and tears in her eyes. You okay? Ridge asked, coming to stand beside her. I'm better than okay. Marin slipped her hand into his. I'm happy. Happy looks good on you. It feels good too. She turned to face him. Thank you, Ridge, for everything. For saving us. For fighting for us. She gestured helplessly. For all of it. Ridge pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. You saved yourselves, he said quietly. All I did was open the door. That's not true, and you know it. Maybe. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. But I'm glad I was there to open it. From inside the cabin, Thomas's voice rang out. Papa Ridge, Mama, come look. There's a bird's nest in the window. Ridge and Marin exchanged a smile. We should go inside, she said. We should. But they stayed there a moment longer, holding each other, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and thinking about all the days to come. The trial was over. Dawes Heller was condemned to die. The fear that had haunted them for so long was finally beginning to fade, and in its place, something new was growing, something that looked a lot like hope. The weeks that followed the trial were supposed to be peaceful. They were supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter, a time for healing and building and learning to live without fear. And for a while, they were. Ridge threw himself into the work of expanding the cabin, rising before dawn to cut timber and haul logs, and lay the foundation for the 2 new rooms he had promised. Marin worked alongside him when she could, learning skills she had never imagined she would need, discovering muscles she didn't know she had. The children helped too, Samuel proving surprisingly adept with a hammer, Clara taking charge of the planning and organization, Thomas providing what he called supervision from his perch on a stack of lumber. They were becoming a family, not just in name, but in the 1,000 small ways that mattered. The shared meals and inside jokes, the arguments and reconciliations, the quiet moments of connection that accumulated like snowflakes until suddenly there was something solid and real where before there had been only strangers. Ridge was different with the children than Marin had expected. She had thought he might be distant, awkward, uncertain how to interact with young people after so many years alone. But instead, he seemed to come alive in their presence. He taught Samuel how to track deer through the forest, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to care for the horse with gentle hands and patient words. He let Clara help him with the accounts, showing her how to balance the books and plan for the future, treating her ideas with the same respect he would give an adult. And with Thomas, he was something close to magic. The little boy had attached himself to Ridge with the fierce, unshakable devotion that only young children can muster. He followed the cowboy everywhere, chattering endlessly, asking questions about everything from why the sky was blue to why horses didn't wear shoes like people did. Any other man might have found it exhausting, might have pushed the boy away, or lost patience with the constant interruptions. But Ridge listened to every question as if it were the most important thing in the world, answered each one seriously and thoroughly, never made Thomas feel like a nuisance or a burden. "Papa Ridge?" Thomas asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Why did you help us? That night in the snow?" Ridge was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Then he said, "Because it was the right thing to do." "But how did you know it was the right thing?" "I didn't at first. I just knew that you needed help, and I could give it." Ridge pulled the boy closer, his voice thoughtful. "Sometimes, Thomas, that's all right means. Seeing someone who needs help and deciding to give it, even when it's hard." Thomas nodded slowly, processing this. "Is that why you're going to be my papa? Because Mama needed help?" "No." Ridge's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm going to be your papa because I love your mama, and because I love you, and your brother, and your sister. The helping, that came first, but the love came after. And the love is what matters." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I love you too, Papa Ridge." Ridge's throat tightened. He had thought, after Rebecca and Michael died, that he would never hear those words again. Had thought that part of his life was over, sealed away behind walls of grief and solitude. But here was this small boy, this child who had no blood connection to him whatsoever, offering his heart freely and without reservation. "I know you do, son," Ridge said softly. "I know you do." From inside the cabin, Marin watched them through the window, tears streaming down her face. Happy tears, she told herself. These are happy tears. But even as she wiped them away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A shadow at the edge of her vision, a whisper of unease that she couldn't quite name. The trial was over, Heller was condemned, they were safe, and yet she couldn't escape the sense that the other shoe was about to drop. She told herself she was being paranoid, told herself that years of fear and hardship had trained her to expect the worst, even when the worst had already passed. Told herself that this new happiness was real, was solid, was something she could trust. But the shadow remained. It happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after they returned from Fargo. Ridge had gone into town for supplies, a routine trip, nothing out of the ordinary. He had kissed Marin goodbye that morning, tousled Thomas's hair, told them all he would be back by nightfall. The children had waved from the porch until his horse disappeared over the rise, and then they had gone back inside to continue their lessons. Marin was teaching Clara to read poetry, the same battered book Pete had given her before the trial, when she heard the hoofbeats. Her first thought was that Ridge had forgotten something, had turned around and come back. But the sound was wrong. Too many horses, too fast, coming from the wrong direction. She crossed to the window and looked out, and her blood turned to ice. 6 riders were approaching from the east. They were still distant, maybe half a mile out, but they were moving with purpose, heading directly for the cabin. And even at this distance, Marin could see the glint of metal at their hips. Guns. "Clara." Her voice was calm, steady, betraying none of the terror that was clawing at her chest. "Take your brothers to the root cellar. Now." "Mama, what's—" "Now, Clara. Don't argue. Just go." Clara's face went pale, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed Thomas with one hand and Samuel with the other and hurried toward the trapdoor by the fireplace. Maureen waited until she heard the hatch close behind them, then grabbed the rifle from above the mantel and the revolver from the drawer by the bed. She had been through this before. She knew what to do. Lock the doors, barricade the windows, wait for help that might not come. But this time was different. This time, Ridge wasn't on his way back from a trip that instinct had told him to cut short. This time, there were no federal marshals watching the roads. This time, she was alone with 3 children and 6 armed men riding toward her with God only knew what intentions. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Marin positioned herself by the window, rifle raised, heart pounding. She could see them clearly now, rough-looking men in range clothes, their faces hard and cold. The leader was a tall man with a scar across his cheek, riding slightly ahead of the others. They reined in about 50 yards from the cabin. The leader dismounted, handed his reins to one of his men, and walked forward with his hands raised, a gesture of peace that Marin didn't believe for a second. "Mrs. Elwood?" His voice carried clearly across the distance. "We need to talk." Marin didn't respond, didn't move, just kept the rifle trained on his chest. "I know you're in there," the man continued. "I know you're armed, and I know you're scared. But I promise you, we're not here to hurt you." He paused. "We're here because Dawes Heller wants to make you an offer." The name hit her like a physical blow. Heller. She had thought he was done, finished, locked away in a cell waiting to hang. But of course he wouldn't go quietly. Of course he would have one last trick to play. "Heller is going to die," she called back. "There's nothing he can offer me." "You might be surprised." The man's smile was thin, predatory. "See, Mr. Heller has friends, powerful friends. Friends who are willing to help him if he can give them what they want." "And what do they want?" "Your silence, Mrs. Elwood. Your testimony was the nail in his coffin. But if you were to recant, say you made it all up, that you lied to get revenge, well..." The man spread his hands. "His lawyers think they could get a new trial, and with no credible witnesses, I'll never recant. What I said was true, every word. I know it was. But here's the thing." The man's voice hardened. "Mr. Heller isn't asking nicely. He's got your children's names. He knows where they go to school, who their friends are, what route they take home." He paused. "If you don't recant, bad things start happening. Maybe to you. Maybe to those pretty little kids of yours." Fear surged through Marin's body, hot and cold at once. Her children. He was threatening her children. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice wavered. "Am I?" The man laughed. "Mrs. Elwood, I've worked for Dawes Heller for 15 years. I've done things you can't even imagine. Killing a woman and 3 kids?" He shrugged. "That's a Tuesday afternoon for me." Marin's finger tightened on the trigger. She could shoot him, one shot, right through the chest. But then there were still 5 other men, all armed, all probably just as ruthless. She might get 1 or 2 more before they got her, but it wouldn't be enough. "Think," she told herself, "think." "How do I know you'll leave us alone?" she asked, stalling for time. "If I recant, what guarantee do I have that Heller won't just come after us anyway?" "You have Mr. Heller's word." "His word means nothing." "Maybe not. But here's the alternative." The man's voice dropped, deadly serious. "You refuse, and I burn this cabin to the ground with you and your children inside, right now, today." He paused. "Or you agree we all go our separate ways and Mr. Heller gets his new trial. It's not a hard choice, Mrs. Elwood." From under the cabin floor, Marin heard a small sound. Thomas, whimpering with fear. Her heart clenched. Her babies were down there, depending on her to keep them safe, and she was failing them. No, she wasn't failing them. She was fighting for them, the only way she knew how. "I need time to think," she said. "You have 5 minutes." "That's not..." "5 minutes, Mrs. Elwood, and then we come in." The man turned and walked back to his horse, leaving Marin alone with the weight of an impossible choice. She sank down against the wall, her mind racing. 5 minutes. 5 minutes to figure out how to save her children from 6 armed killers. 5 minutes to find an escape that didn't exist. Ridge. If only Ridge were here. He would know what to do. He always knew what to do. But Ridge was miles away, in town, with no idea that anything was wrong. By the time he got back, it would be over, one way or another. Think! She looked around the cabin, searching for anything that might help. The rifle. 1 shot before she had to reload. The revolver. 6 shots, if she was lucky enough to use them all. The kitchen knife, the axe by the door, the heavy iron poker by the fireplace. None of it was enough. Not against 6 men with guns. But then her eyes fell on something else. The lantern on the table, still half full of kerosene, and beside it, a box of matches. An idea began to form in her mind, a desperate, crazy, probably suicidal idea. But it was the only one she had. She moved quickly, trying not to make any noise that would alert the men outside. Grabbed the lantern, the matches, a bundle of dry kindling from the stack by the fireplace. Doused the kindling in kerosene and arranged it near the back door, the one that opened toward the barn, away from where the men were waiting. Then she crept to the trap door and lifted it just enough to whisper down into the darkness. "Clara, listen to me carefully." "Mama?" Clara's voice was trembling. "Mama, what's happening?" "There are bad men outside. I'm going to create a distraction, and when I do, I need you to take your brothers and run. There's a trail behind the barn that leads to the Hendersons' farm. Remember the family we visited last month?" "I remember." "Good. Run as fast as you can, don't stop for anything, and tell Mrs. Henderson to send someone to town for Papa Ridge. Do you understand?" "But, Mama, do you understand?" A pause. Then, very quietly, "Yes, Mama." "Good girl. I love you." "I love all of you. Now, stay quiet until you hear the signal." "What signal?" Marin looked at the kerosene-soaked kindling, at the matches in her hand. "You'll know it when you hear it." She lowered the trap door and took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples. But beneath the fear there was something else, a cold, hard determination that she had never felt before. These men had come to threaten her children. They had come to destroy everything she had fought so hard to build, and she was not going to let them. Not tonight. She crossed to the back door and opened it just a crack, just enough to toss the bundle of kindling outside. It landed in a pile of dry brush near the barn, exactly where she had aimed. Then she struck a match and threw it. The kerosene caught immediately, flames leaping up with a hungry roar. The dry brush caught next, and within seconds the fire was spreading, racing toward the barn with terrifying speed. From the front of the cabin she heard shouts of alarm. "Fire! The barn's on fire! Get water! Now!" Marin didn't wait to see what happened next. She threw open the trapdoor and hauled the children out, one by one, pushing them toward the back door. "Go! Run! Don't look back!" Clara grabbed Thomas's hand, Samuel grabbed Clara's, and together they raced out into the night. Marin watched them disappear into the darkness, her heart aching with love and fear and desperate hope. And then she turned to face the men who were already breaking down the front door. The leader was first through, his face twisted with rage. Behind him came two others, their guns drawn and ready. "You stupid bitch," he snarled. "You think a fire's going to stop us?" "No." Marin raised the revolver, her hand steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "But maybe this will." She fired. The first shot took the leader in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second caught one of his men in the chest. The third went wide, smashing through a window, but the fourth found its mark. Another man down, clutching his leg and screaming. 3 shots left. 3 men still standing. Marin backed toward the fireplace, her mind racing. She couldn't reload fast enough, couldn't fight them hand to hand, couldn't... A gunshot cracked through the air, and pain exploded in her side. She staggered, her hand pressing against the wound, hot blood seeping between her fingers. The revolver slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. "That's enough," the leader said, advancing toward her. Blood was streaming from his wounded shoulder, but his eyes were clear and cold. "You've made this much harder than it needed to be, Mrs. Elwood. Now we're going to do this the hard way." Marin looked up at him, defiant despite the pain. "My children are gone. They'll reach the neighbors. They'll bring help. Maybe. But by the time help arrives, you'll be dead, and this cabin will be ash." The leader raised his gun. "Any last words?" Marin thought about her children running through the darkness toward safety. Thought about Ridge, who would come home to find her gone. Thought about everything she had survived, everything she had overcome, everything she had still hoped to do and see and be. "Go to hell," she said. The leader smiled. "Ladies first." His finger tightened on the trigger, and then the front door exploded inward. Ridge came through like a force of nature. a fury of fists and fury and righteous rage that scattered men like leaves in a windstorm. He had a shotgun in his hands and a pistol at his hip, and he used both with devastating efficiency. One man went down before he could even turn around. Another got off a shot that went wild before Ridge's fist connected with his jaw, sending him crashing into the wall. The leader tried to run, tried to make it out the back door, but Ridge caught him by the collar and threw him to the ground. "Where are my children?" Ridge's voice was barely human, more growl than words. "Gone," Marin gasped, clutching her wounded side. "I sent them to the Hendersons. They're safe." Ridge's eyes met hers, and for just a moment the rage faded into something else. Relief, love, fear. "You're hurt. I'll live." She managed a weak smile. "You came back. I saw the fire from the road. Knew something was wrong." Ridge turned back to the leader, who was trying to crawl toward his fallen gun. One boot on the man's back stopped him cold. "Who sent you?" "Go to hell." "Wrong answer." Ridge pressed down harder. "I'll ask one more time. Who sent you?" The man laughed, a broken, bitter sound. "Dawes Heller." "Who else?" He wanted the woman to recant, wanted his new trial. He coughed, blood staining his lips. "But it doesn't matter now. Even if you kill me, he's got more men. He'll keep coming until what? Until she's dead. Until everyone who testified against him is dead." The man's eyes glittered with malice. "You can't stop it. You can't." Ridge hit him. One blow, precise and brutal, and the man went limp. "Ridge." Marin's voice was fading, the edges of her vision going gray. "Ridge, I think I need—" She slumped against the wall, and Ridge caught her before she hit the ground. "Stay with me," he said, his voice cracking. "Marin, stay with me. Help is coming. Just stay with me. The children are safe. You saved them. You were so brave." Tears were streaming down his face now. This man who never cried, who had built walls around his heart so high that nothing could penetrate them. "Please, Marin. Please don't leave me." Marin reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers leaving a smear of blood against his skin. "I love you," she whispered. And then the world went dark. She woke to pain. It was the first thing she was aware of, a throbbing, burning agony in her side that made her gasp and try to curl into herself. But hands held her down, gentle but firm, and a voice was speaking to her, telling her to be still, to breathe, to let the medicine work. "Easy, Mrs. Elwood. Easy. You're safe now." Marin forced her eyes open. She was in a bed. Not the familiar bunk in the cabin, but something softer, cleaner. White sheets, white walls, the smell of carbolic acid and clean linen. A hospital. She was in a hospital. "The children," she croaked. "Where are my children?" "Right here, Mama." Claire's face appeared above her, pale and tear-streaked but alive. Wonderfully, beautifully alive. Behind her, Samuel was clutching Thomas's hand, both boys looking at her with wide, frightened eyes. "You're okay," Marin breathed. "You're all okay." "We made it to the Hendersons' farm," Clara said. "Just like you said. Mrs. Henderson sent her son to town for help, and Papa Ridge came." Her voice broke. "Mama, we thought you were dead. There was so much blood, and you wouldn't wake up, and—" "Shh." Marin reached out, ignoring the pain, and pulled her daughter close. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." One by one, the other children climbed onto the bed, curling around her like puppies seeking warmth. Marin held them as tightly as her wounded body would allow, tears streaming down her face, her heart so full of love and gratitude that it felt like it might burst. They were alive. All of them were alive. "Marin?" She looked up. Ridge stood in the doorway, his face haggard and exhausted, but his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "Ridge!" She held out her hand, and he crossed to her in 3 strides, taking it in both of his. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have—" "Don't." His voice was rough. "Don't apologize. You saved our children, Marin. You fought off 6 armed men to give them time to escape. You have nothing to apologize for." "But I scared you." Ridge laughed, a broken, incredulous sound. "Scared me?" Woman, you terrified me. When I saw that fire, when I realized what was happening, he shook his head. I've never been so afraid in my life. Not even when Rebecca and Michael were sick. Not even when I thought I was going to die alone. I'm sorry. Stop saying that. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. You're alive. Our children are alive. That's all that matters. What happened to the men, the ones who attacked us? Ridge's expression darkened. 2 dead, 3 in custody. The leader, the one with the scar, he's talking to the marshals right now, telling them everything about Heller's network, everyone who's been helping him. He paused. It's over, Marin. Really over this time. Heller's execution was moved up after the attack. He hangs tomorrow morning. Tomorrow. Ridge met her eyes, and then we never have to think about him again. Marin wanted to believe it, wanted to believe that this nightmare was finally, truly over. But she had been burned too many times before, had learned too harshly that hope was dangerous. What if there are more? More men? More attacks? Then we'll face them together. Ridge's grip on her hand tightened. I'm not letting you go, Marin. Not now. Not ever. Whatever comes, we'll face it as a family. A family. The words settled over her like a warm blanket, soothing some of the fear and pain that had taken up residence in her heart. Okay, she said softly. Together. The execution was held at dawn in the courtyard of the territorial prison. Marin wasn't there. She was still recovering in the hospital, too weak to travel, but Ridge went. He stood in the crowd with the other witnesses, watching as Dawes Heller was led to the gallows. The condemned man was a shadow of the monster he had been. His expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a rough prison uniform. His arrogant bearing had crumbled, leaving behind a stooped, broken figure who shuffled toward his death with none of the defiance he had shown at his trial. They offered him last words. He refused. The hood was placed over his head. The noose was adjusted around his neck. And then, with a single pull of a lever, Dawes Heller dropped through the trapdoor and into eternity. Ridge watched the body swing, watched it twitch, and then go still. He felt nothing, no satisfaction, no relief, no closure, just a weary emptiness, and behind it, a desperate need to get back to the woman and children who were waiting for him. It's over, he thought. It's finally over. He turned and walked away without looking back. Marin's recovery was slow but steady. The bullet had done significant damage, cracked 2 ribs, nicked her liver, come within inches of her spine, but the doctor said she was lucky. Another inch to the left, and she would have bled out before Ridge found her. Another inch to the right, and she would never have walked again. You've got an angel watching over you, Mrs. Elwood, the doctor said during one of his visits. Or maybe you're just too stubborn to die. Both, probably, Marin said with a weak smile. The children visited every day, bringing drawings and stories and wildflowers they had picked from the fields around the hospital. Thomas insisted on climbing into bed with her, curling up against her uninjured side like a kitten. Clara read to her from the poetry book, her voice steady and clear. Samuel, quieter than the others, simply held her hand and looked at her with eyes that said everything words couldn't express. And Ridge was there every moment he could spare, holding her hand, reading to her, telling her about the progress on the cabin. The fire had damaged the barn, but not badly. It was already repaired. About the letters of support that had been pouring in from all over the territory. People who had heard her story, who admired her courage, who wanted to help however they could. You're a hero, you know, he said one evening as the sun set outside her window. The newspapers are calling you the bravest woman in Dakota. I'm not brave, Marin said. I was terrified the whole time. That's what bravery is. Being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. Ridge squeezed her hand. You saved our children, Marin. You held off 6 men long enough for them to escape. That's not nothing. I had help. If you hadn't come when you did, but I did come. Ridge's voice was soft but fierce. I will always come. Wherever you are, whatever danger you're in, I will find you. I promise. Marin looked at him, at this man who had pulled her from the jaws of death, not once, but twice, who had given her a home when she had none, a future when she had given up on futures, who had loved her and her children with a devotion so fierce and unwavering that it still took her breath away. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." Ridge leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Now, get some rest. The doctor says you can go home next week, and there's still a lot of work to do." "Home," Marin repeated. The word felt different now, fuller, richer, weighted with meaning. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." A week later, she was well enough to travel. Ridge brought the wagon himself, padding the back with blankets and pillows until it was almost as comfortable as a bed. The children rode in the back with her, Thomas tucked under one arm, Clara and Samuel pressed close on either side, while Ridge drove, glancing back every few minutes to make sure she was all right. The journey was slow, careful, Ridge avoiding every bump and pothole in the road. But finally, as the sun began to set and the sky turned gold and rose and purple, they crested the final hill and the cabin came into view. It looked different than she remembered. The new rooms were finished now, 2 additions jutting out from the original structure, doubling the living space. Fresh white curtains hung in the windows. A rocking chair sat on the porch, next to a small table where a vase of wildflowers waited. "Ridge," she breathed, "it's beautiful." "The neighbors helped," he said, a note of embarrassment in his voice. "While you were in the hospital, they wanted to do something, and I figured," he shrugged, "figured we needed the extra space now that we're officially a family." Marin felt tears pricking at her eyes. She blinked them back, but they came anyway, streaming down her cheeks as she looked at this place that had become her home, at this man who had become her partner, at these children who had survived so much and still found room in their hearts for hope. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Ridge helped her down from the wagon, lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing. He carried her up the porch steps and through the front door, and the children raced ahead, eager to show her all the changes they had helped make. "Look, Mama, I have my own bed now. And there's a real kitchen with a real stove. Papa Ridge made a shelf for my books." Marin looked around at the cabin, at the fresh paint and new furniture, at the curtains and rugs, and all the small touches that turned a house into a home, and she felt something shift inside her, something that had been broken for so long she had forgotten what wholeness felt like. She was safe. Her children were safe. And for the first time in years, she believed, truly believed, that the future held more joy than sorrow. "Welcome home, Marin," Ridge said softly. She turned to look at him, and the love in his eyes took her breath away. "Home," she repeated. "Yes, I think I'm finally home." That night, after the children were in bed and the cabin was quiet, Marin sat on the porch with Ridge, wrapped in a blanket and watching the stars wheel overhead. The night was cold but clear, and the sky seemed infinite, a vast expanse of darkness studded with points of light. "I've been thinking," Ridge said quietly, "about everything that's happened, about how we got here. And I keep coming back to that first night, the blizzard, finding you and the children in that tent." He shook his head slowly. "If I had kept riding, if I had decided it wasn't my problem, if I had been even 5 minutes later. But you weren't. You stopped. You helped. I almost didn't." Ridge's voice was barely above a whisper. "I was tired, Marin. Tired of everything. I had spent 12 years convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that being alone was better than risking loss again. And when I saw you out there, my first instinct was to keep going, to stay safe in my solitude." "What changed your mind?" Ridge was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I saw Thomas. He was so small, so still, and I thought about Michael, about the son I lost. And I knew I couldn't leave that child to die. Couldn't add another ghost to the ones that were already haunting me." Marin reached over and took his hand. "You saved us. Whatever your reasons, whatever doubts you had, you saved us." "No." Ridge turned to look at her, his eyes intense in the starlight. "You saved me. You and the children. You gave me a reason to live again, something to fight for. Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions, waiting to die." He paused. "You brought me back to life, Marin. I can never repay that. You don't have to repay it. That's not how love works. Then how does it work? Marin thought about the question, really thought about it, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water. I think love is just showing up, day after day, through good times and bad, through joy and sorrow and everything in between. It's not about grand gestures or heroic acts. It's about being there, being present, being willing to share the burdens and the blessings. She squeezed his hand. You've done that, Ridge, every day since you found us, and that's enough. That's more than enough. Ridge pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. I want to marry you, he said. I know I asked before and you said yes, but there was never time to make it official. I want to change that. Now? Soon. As soon as you're well enough. He pulled back to look at her. I want you to be my wife, Marin. I want to stand up in front of God and everyone and promise to love you for the rest of my life. I want everyone to know that we're a family, really, truly, officially. Marin felt her heart swell with emotion. Yes, I want that too. Ridge smiled, a real smile, warm and bright and full of hope. It transformed his face, made him look younger, softer, like the man he might have been before grief had carved its mark on him. Then it's settled. We'll have the wedding as soon as the spring thaw comes. We'll invite everyone, the neighbors, Pete and the boys, anyone who wants to come. We'll make it a celebration. A celebration, Marin repeated. The word felt strange on her tongue, unfamiliar. She couldn't remember the last time she had celebrated anything. But looking at this man, feeling his arms around her, thinking about the children sleeping peacefully inside, she thought maybe it was time to learn again. Time to celebrate the life they had built from the ashes of the one they had lost. Time to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. A celebration, she said again, and this time she smiled. The spring thaw came early that year, as if the earth itself was eager to wash away the winter's sorrows. Snow melted into rushing streams, brown grass gave way to green, and wildflowers began to bloom across the prairie, yellow and purple and white, carpeting the hills in a riot of color. Marin grew stronger every day. The wound in her side healed slowly but surely, leaving behind a scar that she would carry for the rest of her life, a reminder of what she had survived and what she had overcome. She worked in the cabin, helped with the garden, played with the children, and slowly, gradually, learned to live without fear. It wasn't easy. There were nights when she woke in a cold sweat, certain that she had heard hoofbeats outside. There were moments when a sudden noise made her reach for a gun that wasn't there. There were days when the shadow of Dawes Heller seemed to fall across everything, darkening even the brightest moments. But Ridge was always there, patient, steady, unfailing. He held her when she cried, talked her through the panic attacks, reminded her again and again that she was safe, that she was loved, that she was not alone. And slowly, like ice melting under spring sunshine, the fear began to loosen its grip. The wedding was held on the first day of May, in a meadow behind the cabin where wildflowers grew thick and the mountains rose in the distance like a promise. Half the territory seemed to have turned out, neighbors they had never met, friends old and new, federal marshals who had helped bring Heller to justice. Even Marcus Cole was there, his face still marked by grief, but his eyes showing the first hints of healing. Marin wore a simple white dress that Clara had helped her sew, with wildflowers woven into her hair. Ridge wore his Sunday best, a clean shirt and vest, his boots polished to a shine. The children stood beside them as witnesses, Thomas bouncing with excitement, Clara trying to look dignified, Samuel watching everything with quiet, intense focus. The minister was a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through, a kindly old man with a gentle voice and a talent for finding the right words. Marriage, he said, is not just a union of two people. It is the creation of something new, a family, a home, a future that neither partner could build alone. It is a promise to face whatever comes together, to share both the burdens and the blessings, to love and support each other until death parts you. He turned to Ridge. Do you, Ridge Callahan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Ridge's voice was strong and clear, his eyes never leaving Marin's face. And do you, Marin Elwood, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. Marin's voice trembled slightly, but the words were firm. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. The minister smiled. You may kiss your bride. Ridge pulled her close and kissed her, gently at first, then with increasing passion as the crowd cheered and the children giggled and the spring breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the meadow. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marin looked up at her husband, and felt something she had almost forgotten existed. Joy, pure, uncomplicated, overwhelming joy. I love you, she said. I love you too. Ridge grinned. Mrs. Callahan. Mrs. Callahan. She liked the sound of that. The celebration lasted well into the evening with food and music and dancing under the stars. The children stayed up far past their bedtime, running wild with the other children from neighboring farms, their laughter echoing across the prairie. Marin danced with Ridge, with Marcus Cole, with Pete and the other men who had helped protect them, with anyone who asked. And when the last guest had gone home and the last lantern had been extinguished, Marin stood on the porch of her cabin, her home, and looked out at the world she had almost lost. The night was quiet, peaceful. A gentle breeze stirred the new leaves on the trees. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Ridge came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. Happy? He asked. Yes. Marin leaned into him, savoring his warmth, his strength, his presence. I never thought I could be this happy again. Neither did I. Ridge pressed a kiss to the top of her head. But here we are. Here we are, Marin repeated. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The blizzard, the rescue, the trial, the attacks, the healing, all the pain and fear and desperation, all the love and courage and hope. It had been a long, hard road, and there would be more challenges ahead. Life on the prairie was never easy, and scars, both visible and invisible, took time to heal. But she wasn't facing it alone anymore. She had Ridge, she had her children, she had a home, a family, a future. And that, she thought, was enough, more than enough. The summer that followed their wedding was the sweetest Marin had ever known. The days stretched long and golden, filled with the kind of simple pleasures she had almost forgotten existed. Morning coffee on the porch with Ridge, watching the mist rise from the meadows. Afternoon lessons with the children, their voices rising and falling like music as they worked through arithmetic and spelling. Evening walks through the wildflower fields, Thomas on Ridge's shoulders, Clara and Samuel racing ahead to see who could spot the first deer. The cabin had transformed into something unrecognizable from the sparse bachelor quarters Ridge had maintained for 12 years. Curtains hung in every window, sewn by Clara, from fabric Marin had ordered from town. A vegetable garden flourished behind the house, tended by Samuel with a dedication that surprised everyone. Thomas's wooden horses had multiplied into a small herd, lined up on a shelf Ridge had built specifically to display them, and everywhere, on the table, on the windowsills, in small vases tucked into corners, there were wildflowers, because Thomas had decided it was his job to keep the house pretty and took his responsibility very seriously. Mama? Clara asked one evening as they sat together mending clothes while the boys played outside. Do you ever think about before? About Papa Daniel and the farm and everything? Marin set down her needle and considered the question carefully. It was the first time Clara had mentioned Daniel since they arrived at Ridge's cabin, and she sensed that the question carried more weight than it appeared. Sometimes, she admitted, I think about your father every day. I loved him very much, and I'll always carry that love with me. She paused, searching for the right words. But thinking about the past doesn't mean I'm unhappy with the present. Does that make sense? Clara nodded slowly. I think so. It's like you can miss something and still be glad about where you are now. Exactly. Marin reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. Do you miss him? Your father? Yes. Sometimes I try to remember his face, and I can't quite see it clearly anymore, and that makes me sad. Clara's voice wavered. But then I think about Papa Ridge, and how he makes you smile, and how he's always patient with Thomas, even when Thomas is being annoying, and I think Papa Daniel would be happy that we found someone who takes care of us. Marin felt tears pricking at her eyes. I think he would be happy too, sweetheart. Mama? Clara hesitated. Is it okay if I love them both? Papa Daniel and Papa Ridge? Of course it is. Marin pulled her daughter into a hug. Love isn't something that runs out. The more you give, the more you have. You can love your father's memory and love Ridge at the same time. They're different kinds of love, but they're both real. Clara relaxed into her arms. I'm glad. I was worried it would be disloyal to love someone new. It's not disloyal. It's brave. Marin pressed a kiss to the top of her daughter's head. Your father would be so proud of you, Clara, of how strong you've been, how you've taken care of your brothers, how you've opened your heart to a new family even after everything we've been through. They sat there for a while, mother and daughter, taking comfort in each other's presence. And when Ridge came in from the barn a few minutes later, Clara surprised everyone by running to him and throwing her arms around his waist. Thank you, she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. For saving us. For being our family. Ridge looked at Marin over Clara's head, his eyes full of emotion. Then he wrapped his arms around the girl and held her close. Thank you for letting me be part of it, he said quietly. Thank you for giving me a second chance. The moment was broken by Thomas bursting through the door, covered in mud from head to toe and grinning like he had just discovered buried treasure. Papa Ridge, Mama, come look! Samuel found a frog! The adults exchanged a look, part exasperation, part amusement, and then Ridge scooped Thomas up, mud and all, and carried him outside to see the frog while Clara and Marin followed, laughing. It was, Marin thought, a perfect ordinary evening, and somehow that made it extraordinary. As the weeks passed, the scars of their ordeal began to fade, not disappear entirely, but soften, becoming part of the tapestry of their lives rather than the dominant pattern. Marin still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at unexpected loud noises, still found herself checking the horizon for approaching riders, but the episodes grew less frequent, less intense, less consuming. Ridge helped. He was endlessly patient with her fears, never dismissing them or minimizing them, but also never feeding them. When she woke trembling in the night, he held her until the shaking stopped. When anxiety crept over her during the day, he found small tasks for her to focus on, practical, grounding activities that brought her back to the present. And when she needed to talk about what she had been through, he listened without judgment, offering comfort without platitudes. How do you always know what I need? She asked him one night, after a particularly bad episode that had left her exhausted and wrung out. Ridge was quiet for a moment, stroking her hair in the darkness. I don't always know, but I pay attention. And I remember what helped me after Rebecca and Michael died. He paused. I spent years trying to outrun my grief, trying to bury it under work and solitude. It didn't work. The only thing that worked was facing it, feeling it, acknowledging it, letting it be part of me without letting it consume me. And that's what you're helping me do. I'm trying. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. I can't take away what happened to you, Marin. I can't undo the pain or erase the memories, but I can be here. I can remind you that you're safe, that you're loved, that the darkness doesn't get to win. Marin curled closer to him, drawing strength from his warmth. I don't know what I did to deserve you. You survived. Ridge's voice was firm. You fought for your children, faced down a monster, refused to break no matter how hard the world tried to break you. That's what you did. He paused. And you let me love you. That takes courage too, opening your heart after it's been wounded, trusting someone new after trust has been betrayed. I was scared, Marin admitted. That first night when you brought us to the cabin, part of me wanted to run, even though running would have meant death, because at least death was familiar. At least I knew what to expect from it. But you didn't run. No, because I looked at my children and I knew I couldn't give up, not for my sake, but for theirs. She smiled in the darkness. And then I looked at you and something told me, this one is different. This one won't hurt us. What told you that? I don't know. Instinct, maybe. Or hope. What little I had left. She reached up and touched his face. I'm glad I listened, whatever it was. So am I. Ridge captured her hand and kissed her palm. So am I. Fall came to the Dakota Plains in a blaze of color, reds and golds and oranges that seemed to set the landscape on fire. The days grew shorter, the nights grew colder, and the Callahan family began preparing for winter with the methodical efficiency of people who understood what was at stake. Ridge taught Samuel how to hunt, tracking deer through the forest, setting snares for rabbits, recognizing the signs that distinguished good hunting grounds from poor ones. The boy took to it with quiet intensity, returning from each lesson with questions and observations that showed he was paying attention. "He's got a good eye," Ridge told Marin one evening, after Samuel had successfully brought down his first deer. "And more importantly, he's got patience. Too many young hunters get impatient, rush their shots. Samuel waits until he's sure." "He's always been like that," Marin said. "Quiet, watchful, taking everything in before he acts." She paused. "I worried about him during those months at Heller's operation. He retreated so far into himself. Wouldn't talk, wouldn't play, wouldn't do anything but what he was told. He's coming out of it now. I know. I see him laughing, running around with Thomas, actually being a child again." Marin felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "I was afraid I'd lost him, that what Heller did had broken something in him that could never be fixed." "Children are resilient." Ridge put his arm around her shoulders. "And Samuel's got something a lot of kids don't. A mother who fought for him, who never gave up, who got him out of that hell and into something better. That matters. He knows he's loved, knows he's safe. The rest will come with time." As if to prove Ridge's point, Samuel chose that moment to come bursting through the door, his face flushed with excitement. "Papa Ridge, I found tracks by the creek, big ones like you showed me. I think there's a buck bedding down in the thicket." Ridge grinned. "Then we'll check it out tomorrow. Good work, son." Samuel beamed at the praise, and Marin felt her heart swell with gratitude. This small moment, this ordinary exchange between a boy and the man he had come to see as a father, was everything she had hoped for and more. Thomas was different from his brother. Where Samuel was quiet and observant, Thomas was loud and curious, a whirlwind of questions and energy who wanted to know everything about everything immediately. He shadowed Ridge constantly, chattering nonstop, and while Marin occasionally worried that the cowboy would lose patience, Ridge never did. "Why do horses have 4 legs instead of 2? Thomas asked one morning, while Ridge was saddling up for a trip to town. "Because 4 legs are more stable. They can run faster and carry more weight." "Why don't people have 4 legs? "Because we have hands instead. We traded 2 legs for the ability to use tools." "Could I be a horse if I wanted to?" Ridge paused, genuinely considering the question. "You could pretend to be a horse, but you couldn't actually become one. Humans and horses are different kinds of creatures. What if I practiced really hard?" "Then you'd be the best pretend horse in all of Dakota." Ridge swung Thomas up onto his shoulders. "How about we practice right now? I'll be the cowboy, you be my noble steed, and we'll ride into town together." Thomas giggled with delight, and Marin watched them go with a smile on her face. Ridge had been right all those months ago when he told her that Thomas would need a father figure. The boy had latched onto Ridge with the fierce, unshakable devotion of a child who had lost too much and was determined not to lose again. And Ridge, in turn, had opened his heart to this small, noisy, endlessly curious boy in a way that still surprised Marin. "He's good with them," Clara observed, coming to stand beside her mother at the window. "He is. Better than I expected." Clara paused. "When you first told me we were staying here, I was scared. I thought he would be like Mr. Heller. Kind at first, then—" "I know." Marin put her arm around her daughter. "I was scared too at first, but Ridge is nothing like Heller. He's everything Heller pretended to be and never was." "I know that now." Clara leaned into her mother's embrace. "I'm glad we stayed. I'm glad he's our family." "So am I, sweetheart. So am I." Winter arrived with less drama than the previous year. No sudden blizzards, no life-threatening cold snaps, just a gradual descent into the quiet, frozen world that characterized Dakota winters. The cabin was warm and secure, stocked with enough food and firewood to last until spring. The children had their lessons to keep them occupied, their chores to keep them useful, and each other to keep them company. It was, Marin realized, the first truly peaceful winter she had experienced since Daniel died. Christmas came and went in a flurry of homemade gifts and special meals. Ridge carved new wooden animals for Thomas's collection: a wolf, a bear, an eagle with spread wings. Marin sewed new clothes for all the children, plus a warm scarf for Ridge that made him blush when he opened it. Clara and Samuel worked together on a gift for their mother, a book of pressed wildflowers, collected over the summer and carefully preserved between sheets of paper. "It's beautiful," Marin said, tears streaming down her face as she turned the pages. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "We wanted you to have something to remember the summer," Clara explained, "for when it's cold outside and everything's covered in snow. I'll treasure it forever." Marin pulled both children into a hug. "Thank you. Thank you both." Thomas, not to be left out, presented his own gift, a drawing of their family, rendered in the wobbly, enthusiastic style of a 5-year-old artist. The figures were barely recognizable as human, but the labels Thomas had carefully sounded out and written made everything clear. Mama, Papa Ridge, Clara, Samuel, me. "That's us," Thomas announced proudly. "See? We're all smiling because we're happy." Ridge picked up the drawing and studied it with grave attention. "This is excellent work, son. The best family portrait I've ever seen." "Really? Really?" Ridge ruffled the boy's hair. "We should frame it and hang it on the wall." Thomas's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. "Can we? Can we really?" "Absolutely. First thing tomorrow, I'll build a frame, and we'll hang it right here, above the fireplace, where everyone can see it." True to his word, Ridge built a simple wooden frame the next day, and Thomas's drawing took its place of honor above the mantel. It was crooked and childish and objectively not very good, but every time Marin looked at it, she felt her heart swell with love. This was her family. These were her people, and no matter what the future held, she knew that they would face it together. The new year brought changes, both expected and unexpected. The expected change was the thaw, the gradual loosening of winter's grip, the return of warmth and color and life to the prairie. Trees budded, birds returned, and the world seemed to shake off its long sleep and stretch toward the sun. The unexpected change came in the form of a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday in early March, delivered by a writer from town who looked half frozen despite the warming weather. Ridge accepted it with a puzzled frown. They rarely received mail, and when they did, it was usually from Marcus Cole, who had settled in a town about 50 miles away and wrote occasionally to let them know how he was doing. But this letter wasn't from Marcus. The return address was a law office in the territorial capital. "What is it?" Marin asked, seeing the concern on Ridge's face. "I don't know." He opened the envelope and began to read. His frown deepened, then shifted into something that looked almost like shock. "Ridge, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He looked up at her, his expression dazed. "It's... Marin, you need to read this." She took the letter from his hands and began to read. The letter was from a lawyer named Theodore Marsh, representing the estate of one Amos Blackwell. According to the letter, Amos Blackwell had died 3 months ago, leaving behind a substantial fortune and no direct heirs. His will specified that his estate should be distributed among the victims of Dawes Heller's operation, the people who had been held in debt slavery and forced to work under brutal conditions. The federal government, in conjunction with the territorial courts, had compiled a list of verified victims. Marin Elwood Callahan was on that list. Her share of the estate was $17,000. Marin read the number 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding. $17,000. It was more money than she had ever seen, more than she had ever imagined possessing. It was enough to buy a farm outright, to stock it with animals, to live comfortably for years. "I don't understand," she said. "Who is Amos Blackwell? Why would he leave his money to us?" "He was one of Heller's early victims," Ridge said. He had taken the letter back and was reading through the rest of it. According to this, he escaped Heller's operation about 15 years ago, made his way to California, struck gold during the rush. He never forgot what happened to him, and when he died, he wanted his money to go to others who had suffered the same fate. 15 years? Marin shook her head in disbelief. He spent 15 years thinking about people he'd never met? Some wounds don't heal, some injustices don't fade. Ridge set the letter down and took her hands. Marin, this is real. This is actually happening. We're going to receive more money than I've made in the past 10 years combined. What will we do with it? Whatever we want. Ridge's eyes were bright with possibility. We could expand the ranch, buy more land, more cattle, set up accounts for the children's education, build a bigger house, if you want. He paused. Or we could save it, keep it safe for emergencies, for the future, for whatever comes next. Marin looked at him, at this man who had been content to live simply, who had never sought wealth or status, who had found happiness in hard work and quiet moments and the love of a family he had thought he would never have. What do you want? She asked. Ridge considered the question carefully. I want security. I want to know that no matter what happens, drought, disease, disaster, we'll be able to take care of our family. I want the children to have opportunities I never had, education and choices, and the freedom to decide their own futures. He paused. But I don't want things to change between us. I don't want money to make us different people. It won't. Marin squeezed his hands. Money is a tool, Ridge. It can make things easier, but it can't make things better. Not the things that really matter. What we have, what we've built. That's not about money. It never was. So what do we do? Marin thought about it. About the cabin that had become her home, the land that had become her refuge, the life they had built together from nothing. She thought about her children, Clara, who wanted to be a teacher, Samuel, who dreamed of having his own ranch someday, Thomas, who wanted to be everything from a cowboy to a doctor to a horse. We use it wisely, she said finally. We secure our future, provide for our children, help others when we can, but we don't let it change who we are. She smiled. We came through fire together, Ridge. We survived things that should have destroyed us. A little money isn't going to undo that. Ridge laughed, a genuine, delighted sound that warmed her heart. You're remarkable. You know that? I've been told. Well, it bears repeating. He pulled her into his arms. I love you, Marin Callahan. I love you too, Ridge Callahan. She pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of him. Now let's go tell the children. Thomas is going to want to know if we can buy a real horse. He already has a real horse, several of them. He's going to want to know if we can buy more. Ridge groaned, but he was smiling. That boy is going to be the death of me. No, Marin said softly. He's going to be the life of you. They all are. And she meant it. The money changed some things, but not the important ones. They expanded the cabin further, adding a proper schoolroom where Marin could teach the children, and eventually other children from neighboring farms who didn't have access to education. They bought more land, more cattle, built up the ranch into something that could sustain them through even the hardest times. They set aside funds for each child's future, to be accessed when they came of age, giving them the freedom to choose their own paths. But the core of their lives remained the same. Ridge still rose before dawn to tend the animals. Marin still cooked breakfast for her family, still taught lessons, still spent her evenings on the porch, watching the sunset with her husband. The children still had chores, still had rules, still had the structure and discipline that helped them grow into responsible young people, and they still had each other. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall, fall to winter, and the seasons rolled by like a gentle river carrying them toward a future none of them could have imagined. Clara grew tall and serious, developing a passion for books that Marin encouraged with every resource at her disposal. Samuel became an accomplished hunter and tracker, spending long hours in the wilderness with Ridge, learning the skills that would serve him for the rest of his life. And Thomas remained Thomas, loud and curious and endlessly energetic, filling the cabin with noise and laughter and questions about everything under the sun. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Ridge surprised Marin with a gift. It was a simple wooden box, beautifully crafted, with her initials carved into the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a gold locket. "Open it," Ridge said. Marin pressed the tiny catch, and the locket sprang open. Inside were two small photographs, one of Daniel, taken years ago when they were first married, and one of Ridge, taken just a few months before. "How did you—" Marin couldn't finish the sentence. Tears were streaming down her face. found the photograph of Daniel in your things, back when you first came to the cabin. I had a copy made in town. Ridge's voice was gentle. I know you loved him, Marin, and I know that loving me doesn't mean you stopped loving him. I wanted you to have something that honored both, the man who gave you your children and the man who helped you raise them. Marin couldn't speak. She simply threw her arms around Ridge and held him, sobbing into his shoulder, overwhelmed by the depth of his understanding, his generosity, his love. Thank you, she managed finally. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're welcome. Ridge held her close. Happy anniversary, my love. 2 years passed, then 3, then 5. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and the Callahan family became a fixture of the Dakota Territory. Known for their hospitality, their integrity, and the remarkable story of how they had come together in the middle of a blizzard and built a life from nothing. Clara, at 16, announced her intention to attend a teaching college in the East. It was a bold choice for a young woman from the frontier, but Marin and Ridge supported her completely, using some of the Blackwell money to pay for her tuition and board. Are you sure about this? Marin asked, the night before Clara was scheduled to leave. They were sitting on the porch together, watching the stars, the same way they had sat together countless times before. I'm sure. Clara's voice was calm, confident. I want to learn everything I can, Mama. I want to come back and teach other children, children like I was, who don't have access to books or schools or anyone to show them what's possible. You could stay here, teach at the schoolroom we built. I could, but I want more than that. I want to change things, not just for a few children, but for all of them. Clara turned to look at her mother. You taught me that, that one person can make a difference, that fighting for what's right is worth the risk. Marin felt tears pricking at her eyes. When did you get so wise? I learned from the best, Clara smiled. I'll miss you, Mama, all of you. But I'll write every week, and I'll come home for holidays, and when I'm finished, she took a deep breath. When I'm finished, I'm going to make you proud. You already make me proud. Marin pulled her daughter into a hug. You've made me proud every single day since the moment you were born. Clara left the next morning, riding into town with Ridge to catch the stagecoach that would take her east. Marin watched them go, Thomas and Samuel standing beside her, all of them waving until the wagon disappeared over the horizon. Will she be okay? Samuel asked. She'll be more than okay. Marin put her arm around her son. She's going to do amazing things. I want to do amazing things too. You will, sweetheart. In your own time, in your own way. Marin smiled. You all will. Samuel was the next to leave 3 years later. He had grown into a strong, capable young man with Ridge's quiet intensity and his mother's determination. His dream, it turned out, wasn't to stay on the family ranch. It was to start one of his own, further west, in the untamed territories where land was still cheap and opportunity was still plentiful. Are you disappointed? He asked Ridge the day he announced his plans. I know you thought I would take over here. Disappointed? Ridge shook his head. Samuel, I didn't raise you to follow in my footsteps. I raised you to find your own path. If that path leads west, then west is where you should go. But the ranch will be fine. Your mother and I aren't that old yet. Ridge grinned. And Thomas will be here. God knows that boy has enough energy for 3 people. Samuel laughed, a rare, genuine sound that made Marin's heart sing. He does, doesn't he? He does. And he's going to need guidance. Someone to show him how to run things when your mother and I are too old to do it ourselves. Ridge paused. But that's his path, not yours. You go west, son. Build something of your own. Make us proud. I will. Samuel embraced his stepfather, a full, fierce hug that said everything words couldn't. Thank you, Papa Ridge, for everything. You're welcome, son. You're welcome. Thomas, true to everyone's predictions, stayed. He had grown into a young man of boundless energy and enthusiasm, with his mother's warmth and his father's, his adoptive father's, steady strength. He loved the ranch with a passion that surprised everyone, throwing himself into the work with a dedication that put even Ridge to shame. I don't want to leave, he told Marin one evening when she asked if he had any dreams of going elsewhere. This is my home. These are my people. Everything I want is right here. You're not curious about what's out there, the cities, the ocean, all the things you've read about in books? Sure, I'm curious. Maybe I'll visit someday. Thomas shrugged. But visit is different from leave. Clara wanted to teach. Samuel wanted to build something new. I just want to take care of what we already have. He paused. Is that okay? Is it enough? It's more than enough. Marin reached out and touched her son's face. This boy who had been near death when she found him, who had grown into a man of such kindness and strength. It's everything, Thomas. You're everything. 10 years after that first night in the blizzard, Marin stood on the porch of her home and looked out at the world she had built. The ranch stretched out before her, prosperous and thriving. Cattle grazed in the pastures. Horses ran in the corrals. The original cabin had been expanded so many times that it was barely recognizable, a sprawling, comfortable home filled with love and laughter and memories. Ridge came to stand beside her, his hair gray now, but his eyes still bright with the same warmth she had first seen all those years ago. What are you thinking about? He asked. The night you found us. Marin slipped her hand into his. I was so sure we were going to die, so certain that the world had finally beaten us. But it hadn't. No, because you came. She turned to look at him. You said 2 words that night. Not tonight. Do you remember? I remember. Ridge's voice was soft. I looked at you, at your children, freezing in that tent, and I knew I couldn't let it happen. Not tonight. Not any night. You saved us. We saved each other. Ridge pulled her close. That's how it works, Marin. That's how it's always worked. You gave me a reason to live again. I gave you a place to be safe. Together we built something neither of us could have built alone. Marin leaned into him, feeling his warmth, his strength, his love. 10 years they had been together, 10 years of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, ordinary days and extraordinary moments, 10 years of building a life from the ashes of the ones they had lost, and she wouldn't trade a single moment of it. I love you, she said. I love you too. Ridge kissed the top of her head. More than I ever thought I could love anyone again. More than Rebecca. It was a question she had never asked before, had been afraid to ask, afraid of the answer. But now, after 10 years, she felt secure enough to face it. Ridge was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he said, different. Not more, not less. Just different. He paused. Rebecca was my first love, the love of my youth when I still believed the world was kind and the future was bright. Losing her and Michael nearly destroyed me. And me? You were my second chance, the love that came after I had given up on love, after I had convinced myself that I would be alone forever. Ridge's arms tightened around her. You taught me that the heart can heal, that loss doesn't have to be the end, that even in the darkest night, there's still the possibility of dawn. Marin felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Happy tears, grateful tears, the tears of a woman who had been through fire and emerged, scarred but whole, on the other side. I'm glad I found you, she whispered. You didn't find me. I found you. Ridge smiled. In a blizzard, in the middle of nowhere, in a tent that was falling apart around you. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. The best thing? The best thing. He kissed her forehead. Bar none. They stood there together as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple. Behind them, the cabin glowed with warmth and light. Somewhere inside, Thomas was probably making dinner and making a mess at the same time. Somewhere far away, Clara was teaching children to read and write, and Samuel was building a ranch of his own. Their family, their life, their legacy. Ridge? Marin said. Thank you. For that night. For every night since. She turned to face him. Thank you for not riding by, for stopping, for saving us. Thank you for letting me. Ridge cupped her face in his hands. Thank you for trusting me, for loving me, for giving me a family again. Thank you for being brave enough to start over. I wasn't brave. I was desperate. Same thing sometimes. Ridge smiled. Bravery isn't the absence of fear, Marin. It's doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified. And that night in the blizzard, you were the bravest person I had ever seen. Marin thought about that night, about the cold, the fear, the certainty that she and her children would not survive until morning. She thought about the shadow that had appeared through the snow, the stranger who had become her savior, the journey that had brought her from the edge of death to this moment of perfect, profound peace. "We made it," she said softly. "We did. Against all odds. Against all odds." Ridge kissed her, gentle, tender, full of love. "And we're going to keep making it, Marin, for the rest of our lives. Together. Together." It was the most beautiful word she knew. The years continued to pass, as years do, carrying the Callahan family through joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges, ordinary days and extraordinary moments. Clara returned from the East and opened a school that became famous throughout the territory for the quality of its education. Samuel built his ranch and raised a family of his own, sending letters home filled with stories of his adventures. Thomas took over the family ranch and ran it with a skill and dedication that made his parents proud. And Marin and Ridge grew old together, exactly as they had promised they would. They watched their children thrive. They welcomed grandchildren into the world. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and holidays, surrounded by the family they had built from nothing. And on quiet evenings, they sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the prairie, their hands intertwined, their hearts full. "Do you ever regret it?" Ridge asked one evening, when they were both well into their 60s and the world had changed in ways neither of them could have imagined. "Any of it?" Marin thought about the question, thought about Daniel, about Heller, about the blizzard and the trial, and the attack and everything that had come after. Thought about the scars she still carried, visible and invisible, and the price she had paid for the life she now lived. "No," she said finally, "not a single moment." "Not even the hard parts?" "Especially not the hard parts." Marin turned to look at him. "The hard parts made us who we are, Ridge. They taught us what we were capable of, showed us what really mattered. Without them," she shook her head, "without them, we wouldn't appreciate this. Any of this." Ridge nodded slowly. "I feel the same way. Every loss, every struggle, every dark night, they all led here. To you, to our family, to this life." He paused. "I wouldn't trade it for anything." "Neither would I." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, scattered across the vast Dakota sky like diamonds on velvet. The same sky that had watched over them that first night, when Marin had been certain she would die, and Ridge had appeared like an angel sent to save her. "Ridge." "Hmm?" "I'm glad you stopped that night. I'm glad you said, 'Not tonight.'" Ridge smiled. The same warm, gentle smile she had fallen in love with all those years ago. "So am I, Marin. So am I." And they stayed there together, as they had stayed together for decades, watching the stars wheel overhead and thinking about all the nights that had brought them to this one. "Not tonight," he had said. And because of those two simple words, they had been given a lifetime of tomorrows. Marin closed her eyes and let the peace wash over her. The peace of knowing she was loved. The peace of knowing her children were safe and happy. The peace of knowing that no matter what came next, she had already lived a life beyond her wildest dreams. From the cold grip of a blizzard to the warm embrace of a family. From the edge of death to the fullness of life. From a battered tent in the snow to a home filled with love and laughter and memories that would last forever. It had been a long journey, a hard journey. A journey filled with pain and fear and moments when she had been certain she couldn't go on. But she had gone on. And now, at the end of it all, she could look back without regret. She had survived. She had loved. She had built something beautiful from the ashes of everything she had lost. And that, she thought, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.